They thought they could humiliate me one last time, lock me away like I was nothing. But what my family didn't know was that the failure they'd spent 37 years looking down on had been hiding the biggest secret of all. My name is Rose Sterling, and this is the story of how I went from being the forgotten daughter to owning the very ground they stood on. At my sister Brittany's wedding, the golden child's perfect day, my own mother handed me a wedding invitation with no name on it, just to occupant. Like I was a stranger. But I went anyway because I'd promised my dying father I'd always look after family. That was my first mistake. What happened next was something I never could have imagined. They locked me in the bathroom during the ceremony and sent a message to their secret family group chat, one I didn't even know existed. Perfect. This is where she belongs. Out here is for real family only. So, but here's what they didn't know. I wasn't just Rose the family disappointment anymore. I was Rose Sterling, CEO of a multi-million-dollar empire they had no idea existed. So I made one phone call. Just one. Bring them all. 10 limousines. Now. What happened in the next 30 minutes didn't just destroy a wedding. It exposed secrets that had been buried for decades, revealed a sister I never knew I had, and uncovered the truth about who really belonged in this family. By the time I was done, they weren't just silent. They were finished. This is that story. My name is Rose Sterling. I'm 37 years old, and on paper my life looks perfect. I'm the CEO of Sterling Marketing Solutions, a company I built from nothing into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. I live in a penthouse overlooking downtown Seattle, drive a Mercedes, and have more money in my investment portfolio than most people see in a lifetime. But success has a way of feeling hollow when you have no one to share it with. The wedding invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped under a stack of business correspondence that my assistant had left on my kitchen counter. At first glance, it looked elegant enough, cream-colored cardstock with gold embossing, the kind of expensive stationery that screamed, "Look how important this event is." But when I picked it up, my stomach dropped. There was no "Dear Rose" or "Ms. Sterling." Instead, in that perfectly scripted font, it simply read, "To occupant. To occupant," like I was a piece of junk mail. I stared at the invitation for a long moment, feeling that familiar ache in my chest that I'd carried since childhood. Brittany Elizabeth Morrison. My younger sister was getting married to David Jonathan Clark at the prestigious Grandview Manor. The date was circled in gold, Saturday, October 15th. 3 weeks away. The invitation trembled slightly in my hands as I read the details. Black tie required, reception to follow, RSVP requested by October 1st. Everything meticulously planned and gorgeous, just like Brittany herself. But that "to occupant" felt like a slap across the face. A reminder that even at 34, my little sister still saw me as an afterthought. I set the invitation down on my granite countertop and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. From up here, 40 stories above the street, everything looked small and manageable. I could see the Space Needle in the distance, ferries crossing Elliott Bay, people moving like ants through their daily routines. It was a view that usually calmed me, reminded me of how far I'd come from the scared, overlooked girl I used to be. But today, it just made me feel more alone. The memory hit me like it always did when Brittany was involved, sudden and sharp, pulling me back to that hospital room 5 years ago. Dad lying in that narrow bed, his once strong frame reduced to skin and bones, machines beeping steadily around him. The cancer had taken so much from him by then, but his eyes were still clear when he gripped my hand with what little strength he had left. "Promise me something, Rose." He'd whispered, his voice barely audible above the hum of the ventilator. "Promise me you'll always look after your sister. I know things haven't been easy between you two, but she's going to need you. Family is everything, sweetheart. It's all we really have in the end." I'd squeezed his hand and nodded, tears streaming down my face. "I promise, Dad. I'll take care of her." He'd smiled then, that same warm smile that had gotten me through every scraped knee and broken heart of my childhood. "That's my girl. You've always been the strong one, Rose. Don't ever forget that." He died 3 days later. I'd kept that promise even when it cost me. When Brittany's first business venture failed, I'd quietly paid off her debts. When she wanted to take that photography course in Paris, I'd covered her expenses without her even knowing. When she'd called me crying at 2 a.m. because some guy had broken her heart, I'd driven across town to sit with her until sunrise. But somehow none of it seemed to matter. I was still the sister who got invited like a stranger. I picked up my phone and dialed the number I knew by heart, even though we rarely talked anymore. It rang 4 times before she answered. "Sterling Residence, Margaret speaking." Mom's voice was crisp and formal, the same tone she used with telemarketers. "Hi, Mom, it's Rose." There was a pause just long enough to sting. "Oh, Rose. What can I do for you?" Not hello, not how are you, just straight to business. I took a deep breath and forced my voice to stay steady. "I got Brittany's wedding invitation. I wanted to confirm my attendance and see if there's anything I can do to help with the preparations." Another pause, longer this time. In the background, I could hear the faint sound of classical music, probably one of those meditation playlists Mom had become obsessed with since Dad died. "You weren't really expected to come." The words hit me like ice water. No sugarcoating, no attempt at diplomacy, just cold, honest indifference. "What do you mean?" I managed to ask, though part of me already knew. "Well, dear, you know how these things are. Limited seating, very intimate guest list. Brittany has so many friends from her art circle, and David's family is quite large. We just assumed you'd be too busy with work anyway." "You always are." I gripped the phone tighter, my knuckles turning white. "She's my sister, Mom." "Of course she is, and we love you very much. But this is Brittany's special day and we want everything to be perfect. You understand?" Perfect. The word that had defined my sister's entire life and by extension had defined my absence from it. I hung up the phone and stood there in my empty penthouse, the silence pressing against my eardrums like a physical weight. Mom's words echoed in my head. "You weren't really expected to come." But really, when had I ever been expected anywhere in this family? The memories came flooding back as they always did when the wound was freshly opened. I was 7 years old again, standing in our childhood kitchen while Mom fussed over 4-year-old Brittany's scraped elbow. It was barely a scratch, really, but you'd have thought she'd severed an artery from the way Mom carried on. "Oh, my poor baby girl," Mom had cooed, covering the tiny mark with 3 different kinds of ointment and a princess bandage. "Mommy's little angel needs to be more careful." Meanwhile, I'd been sitting at the kitchen table with a split lip from falling off my bike, blood still trickling down my chin. When I'd finally worked up the courage to ask for a bandage, Mom had barely glanced my way. "Rose will be fine," she'd said, not even looking up from Brittany's elbow. "She's tough as nails, this one. She can handle anything." That became the family narrative: Rose the resilient, Rose the capable Rose who never needed anything because she was just so naturally strong. While Brittany was Mommy's precious princess who needs to be protected from the world. The pattern continued through elementary school, middle school, high school. When Brittany struggled with math, she got a private tutor and endless patience. When I struggled with the same subject, I was told to figure it out myself because Rose is so smart she'll work it out. When Brittany wanted to quit piano lessons because they were too hard, Mom immediately called the teacher to cancel. When I begged to quit soccer because the coach was verbally abusive, I was told that quitters never win and forced to stick it out for 2 more miserable seasons. But the real sacrifice came when I was 19 and Dad got his diagnosis. Pancreatic cancer, stage 3. The medical bills started pouring in almost immediately, experimental treatments that insurance wouldn't cover, specialists who demanded payment, upfront medications that cost more per month than most people's rent. I was a sophomore at Harvard, studying business administration on a partial scholarship I'd worked my ass off to earn. My grades were perfect. My professors loved me, and I had dreams of maybe working on Wall Street or starting my own consulting firm. but when Dad needed me, there was never really a choice. "I have to drop out," I told my parents during one of our weekly hospital visits. "I can get a job help with the bills." Mom had immediately protested, but not for the reasons I'd hoped. "Oh, Rose, you don't need to do that. You're so resourceful, I'm sure you'll find another way." Meanwhile, Brittany's art school tuition in France was never even discussed as a potential cut. She was 21 and finding herself in Provence, sending home Instagram photos of herself painting landscapes and drinking wine at cafes, while I took a job at a marketing firm and handed over every paycheck to keep Dad alive. The irony wasn't lost on me that I turned out to be good at marketing, really good. Good enough that within 3 years I'd been promoted to senior account manager. Good enough that by 25 I'd saved up $50,000 and was ready to start my own agency. That's when Brittany came home from France with her grand plan to open an upscale salon. She'd learned about European beauty techniques and was convinced she could revolutionize Seattle's beauty scene. The only problem was she had no money and no business experience. "Rose is so smart with money," Mom had said during that awful family dinner where they'd all ganged up on me. "And you know how much she loves to help family." I'd written the check that night, telling myself it was an investment in my sister's future. Brittany had been so grateful, hugging me tight and promising she'd pay me back with interest as soon as the business took off. Bloom Beauty Salon was an instant success. Brittany had inherited Dad's charm and Mom's eye for aesthetics, and within 2 years, she had a waiting list 3 months long. The local newspaper did a feature on her as Seattle's rising beauty star. She was invited to speak at women's entrepreneur conferences. She started dating David, a lawyer from one of the city's most prominent families. And at the salon's 2-year anniversary party, when someone asked how she'd managed to start such a successful business so young, Brittany had smiled that radiant smile of hers and said, "Oh, I did it all myself. Did it all. Pure determination and a little bit of magic." Not one mention of my $50,000. Not one acknowledgement of the financial foundation that had made her dream possible. I'd stood there with my champagne glass watching everyone congratulate my sister on her amazing self-made success and felt more invisible than I'd ever felt in my life. Even when I'd built my own company into something 10 times more successful than her salon, even when I'd made more money than the rest of the family combined, I was still somehow the one who didn't quite belong at their table. But I made Dad a promise. And promises to the dead are sacred. 3 weeks later, I stood at the entrance of Grandview Manor, watching valets in crisp white uniforms whisk away luxury cars with practiced efficiency. The venue was everything I'd expected from Brittany, absolutely breathtaking and completely over the top. The historic mansion sprawled across manicured grounds like something out of a fairy tale, its limestone facade glowing golden in the late afternoon sun. Massive oak trees draped in thousands of tiny white lights created a canopy of stars, while a red carpet stretched from the circular driveway to the grand entrance. I'd chosen my outfit carefully, a simple navy blue dress that cost more than most people's rent, but looked understated enough not to draw unwanted attention. The silk fell perfectly to just below my knees, and I'd paired it with pearls that had belonged to my grandmother. Conservative, elegant, forgettable. Or so I'd hoped. As I approached the entrance, I could hear the soft strains of a full orchestra drifting from inside. Through the tall windows, I caught glimpses of the reception hall, an explosion of white roses and baby's breath that must have cost a fortune. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow patterns across cream-colored walls, and I counted at least 20 round tables draped in ivory silk, each one decorated with centerpieces that were taller than most children. 500 guests, the invitation had said. I recognized many of the faces from Seattle's social pages. City council members, prominent business owners, old money families whose names appeared on hospital wings and university buildings. This wasn't just a wedding. It was a statement about the kind of circles Brittany now moved in. A uniformed usher approached me with a practiced smile. "Good evening, ma'am. Name for the guest list. Rose Sterling. I'm the bride's sister." His smile faltered slightly as he scanned his clipboard, clearly not finding what he expected. After an awkward moment, he looked up with forced cheer. "Of course. Right this way, please." As we entered the main hall, I felt the subtle shift in energy that comes when people notice something unexpected. Conversations didn't stop exactly, but they quieted. Eyes turned my way with that particular blend of curiosity and judgment that wealthy people had perfected into an art form. "Is that Brittany's sister?" I heard someone whisper behind a champagne flute. "I thought she only had one sister," came the response. "Oh no, there are two. But I heard they don't really get along. Family drama, you know how it is." "She looks familiar. Doesn't she run some little marketing company downtown?" Little marketing company, if they only knew. The usher led me to a table near the back table 18, according to the elegant calligraphy on the place card. Not quite the worst table in the room, but close enough to send a message. I was seated with what appeared to be David's college friends and their wives, people young enough to still find wedding receptions genuinely exciting. Before I could settle in, I spotted Brittany making her way through the crowd in my direction. She looked absolutely radiant in a dress that probably cost more than a new car, all flowing silk and delicate beadwork that caught the light with every movement. Her blonde hair was swept up in an elaborate updo that showcased the diamond earrings that had been our grandmother's. The same earrings I'd always assumed would be mine one day, since I was the oldest granddaughter. "Rose?" Brittany's voice carried that performative warmth she'd perfected over the years. "You made it. How wonderful." She air-kissed me on both cheeks, European style, careful not to disturb her makeup. Her smile was bright and perfect, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You look beautiful, Britt," I said, and meant it. Whatever else I thought about my sister, I'd never been able to deny that she was stunning. "Thank you, sweetie. Oh, you simply must meet David's cousin, Patricia. She runs the most darling little art gallery in Pioneer Square. Patricia, this is my older sister, Rose. She's in business." The introduction lasted exactly long enough to be polite before Brittany was whisked away by someone else demanding her attention. I watched her glide through the crowd, stopping to hug and laugh with seemingly everyone in the room, her joy infectious and seemingly genuine. I was still watching when I felt a firm hand on my arm. Mom appeared beside me, resplendent in dusty rose silk, and wearing the same pearls she'd worn to every important family event for the past 20 years. "Rose, darling," she said, her voice low and controlled. "So lovely that you decided to come after all." Her grip on my arm tightened slightly as she guided me toward a quieter corner of the room, away from the main flow of guests. "Now listen to me carefully." She continued, her smile never wavering. "This is Brittany's day, her special moment. I need you to promise me that you won't do anything to upset her or draw attention to yourself. No family drama, no bringing up old grievances. Just smile, be pleasant, and let your sister have her fairy tale. Can you do that for me?" I looked at my mother, really looked at her, and saw something I'd never noticed before. Fear. She was actually afraid of what I might do or say. I smiled and nodded like the good daughter I'd always been. What they did next, I never could have imagined. The ceremony was beautiful, I had to admit. Brittany floated down the aisle like something out of a magazine, and David looked genuinely smitten as she approached the altar. The orchestra played Pachelbel's canon flawlessly, and there wasn't a dry eye in the house when they exchanged vows they'd written themselves. Even I found myself getting a little emotional, remembering the little girl who used to play dress-up in Mom's old wedding dress. During the cocktail hour that followed, I nursed a glass of champagne and made polite conversation with the other guests at my table. They were nice enough people. David's fraternity brothers and their wives, all successful young professionals who seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. For a brief moment, I almost forgot why I'd been dreading this day. It was just before dinner service when I excused myself to find the restroom. The main powder room near the reception hall had a line of women waiting, so I wandered through the mansion's elegantly appointed hallways until I found a smaller, more private bathroom tucked away near what looked like the manor's original library. The restroom was as luxurious as everything else at Grandview marble countertops, gold fixtures and lighting that was actually flattering instead of the harsh fluorescence you usually found in public bathrooms. I touched up my lipstick and checked my hair, taking a moment to collect myself before heading back to face the rest of the evening. That's when I heard the distinct sound of a key turning in a lock. At first, I thought I had imagined it, but when I tried the door handle, it wouldn't budge. I pressed my ear against the heavy wooden door and could hear footsteps retreating down the hallway outside. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice light. "I think the door is stuck. Could someone help me?" Silence. I tried the handle again, pushing against the door with my shoulder. Nothing. The door was definitely locked from the outside. My heart started to race as I realized this couldn't be an accident. You don't accidentally lock someone in a bathroom with a key. That's when my phone buzzed. I pulled it from my purse, expecting maybe a work email or a spam text. Instead, I saw a notification for a group message from something called Sterling Family. I'd never seen this group chat before. I wasn't even sure how I'd been added to it. The message was from Mom. "Perfect. This is where she belongs. Out here is for real family only." I stared at the screen, reading the words over and over, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Below Mom's message, there were other responses starting to come in. Brittany. "Thank God. I was worried she'd find a way to ruin the photos." David. "Your mom is genius. How long should we leave her?" Brittany. "At least until after dinner, maybe longer." Mom. "She'll figure out how to get out eventually. She always does. Rose is so resourceful." There were laugh-crying emojis. Actual emojis. They were laughing about this. I sank down onto the marble floor, my designer dress pooling around me like a deflated balloon. For 37 years, I'd told myself that they loved me, but just had a hard time showing it. That Mom's coldness was just her way of being practical. That Brittany's self-centeredness was just immaturity she'd grow out of. That the constant feeling of being on the outside looking in was all in my head. But this wasn't in my head. This was deliberate, calculated. They'd planned this. While I'd been agonizing over whether to come to the wedding, while I'd been carefully choosing an outfit that wouldn't upstage the bride, while I'd been practicing gracious small talk in my bathroom mirror, they'd been plotting to lock me away like an embarrassing relative they didn't want the neighbors to see. The group chat kept pinging with new messages. More jokes about how I'd probably try to pick the lock with a bobby pin. Speculation about whether I'd start banging on the door and make a scene. Someone, I think it was David's mother, suggesting they should have just not invited me at all. But it was Brittany's final message that broke something fundamental inside me. "She's probably crying in there. Rose always cries when she doesn't get her way. So dramatic." I wasn't crying. For the first time in my entire life, I wasn't crying when my family hurt me. Instead, I felt something I'd never experienced before, a white-hot rage that started in my chest and spread through my entire body like wildfire. All those years of making excuses for them. All those years of convincing myself that if I just tried harder, loved them more, sacrificed more, they'd finally see me as worthy of their affection. All those years of being the good daughter who never complained, never fought back, never demanded the respect I deserved. They thought I was weak. They thought I was pathetic. They thought I was someone they could lock away and forget about while they celebrated with their real family. They had no idea who they were dealing with. My hands stopped shaking. I made one phone call. The number I dialed was one that very few people had access to. It rang twice before a crisp, professional voice answered. "Lisa Chen speaking." "Lisa, it's Rose. I need the executive fleet. All 10 limousines. Bring them to Grandview Manor on Capitol Hill. And I need them now." There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end. In the 5 years that Lisa had been my executive assistant, I had never once used the company fleet for personal business. Hell, most people didn't even know Sterling Enterprises owned a fleet of luxury vehicles. "All 10, Ms. Sterling, are you certain?" "Every single one. Full drivers, full detail. I want them lined up in front of this place like we're hosting a state dinner. How quickly can you make it happen?" "Give me 30 minutes, Lisa said, and I could hear the efficiency kicking in that had made her indispensable to me. "Should I ask what this is regarding?" Family business, I said simply. Lisa had worked for me long enough to know that when I said family business in that particular tone, she shouldn't ask follow-up questions. Understood. Anything else you need? Just the cars, and Lisa. Make sure every driver knows they're representing Sterling Enterprises tonight. Full presentation mode. Consider it done. I hung up and leaned back against the marble wall, a smile playing at the corners of my mouth for the first time all evening. My family thought they knew who Rose Sterling was. They thought I was the struggling little marketing executive who'd never quite lived up to her potential. They had no idea that the little marketing company they liked to dismiss was actually Sterling Enterprises, a multimedia conglomerate that I'd built from nothing into an empire worth over $400 million. It had started innocently enough. After I'd dropped out of Harvard to help with Dad's medical bills, I'd taken that entry-level job at Morrison Marketing just to keep food on the table and money flowing toward the hospital. But I'd always been good with numbers, good with strategy, and it turned out I had a natural instinct for understanding what made people want to buy things. Within 2 years, I was managing accounts that brought in more revenue than some small countries. By year 3, I'd identified inefficiencies in the company's structure that were costing them millions annually. When I presented my findings to the board, they promoted me to senior account director and gave me a bonus large enough to start thinking about my own future. The transition from employee to entrepreneur happened gradually. I started freelance consulting on weekends, taking on clients that Morrison couldn't or wouldn't handle. Then I registered Sterling Marketing Solutions as an LLC, operating it out of my apartment while still working my day job. The first year, I made an additional $50,000. The second year, it was closer to $200,000. By the time I was 28, Sterling Marketing Solutions was generating enough revenue that I could quit Morrison and focus on my own company full-time. But I didn't stop there. I used the profits to acquire smaller marketing firms, expand into public relations, then digital media, then content creation. Every expansion was carefully calculated, every acquisition thoroughly researched. The decision to keep my success secret from my family had been deliberate. I'd watched what happened when people knew you had money. Suddenly you became everyone's solution to their problems. Every family gathering would turn into a pitch session. Every phone call would come with an ulterior motive. I'd already experienced that on a small scale with Brittany's salon loan, and I had no interest in becoming the family ATM. So I'd created a carefully constructed fiction. As far as Mom and Brittany knew, I was Rose Sterling, middle manager at a small marketing company, making decent money, but nothing spectacular. I drove a nice but not ostentatious car, lived in a penthouse that I claimed to be renting, and was always vague about the details of my work when they asked. Meanwhile, Sterling Enterprises had grown into a multimedia powerhouse with offices in 12 states and partnerships with some of the biggest brands in America. We handled marketing campaigns for Fortune 500 companies, managed crisis communications for politicians and celebrities, and had even started producing our own digital content series. Last year's revenue had topped $90 million, and this year we were on track to break $100 million. Through the bathroom door, I could hear the sounds of the reception continuing without me. The orchestra had struck up something lively for dinner service, and I caught snippets of conversation and laughter as guests made their way back to their tables. The master of ceremonies was announcing the first course, and I could hear the clink of silverware against china as 500 people enjoyed their lobster bisque, or whatever ridiculously expensive appetizer Brittany had chosen. They were all out there toasting the happy couple, taking photos, making memories that would last a lifetime. And here I was, locked in a bathroom like a misbehaving child, listening to my own family celebrate the fact that they'd successfully excluded me from the festivities. But not for much longer. 27 minutes later, I heard engines roar outside. The sound started as a low rumble in the distance, like thunder rolling across the hills. But this wasn't weather. It was the synchronized purr of 10 perfectly tuned V8 engines approaching in formation. Even through the thick walls of the manor and the closed bathroom door, I could hear it building, getting closer, more imposing with each passing second. Then came the sound I'd been waiting for, the distinctive crunch of gravel under heavy tires, as 10 identical black Lincoln Navigator limousines rolled up the circular driveway of Grandview Manor in perfect single file. Each vehicle was 42 feet of gleaming obsidian metal and tinted windows, the kind of cars that usually transported heads of state or A-list celebrities who demanded absolute luxury and privacy. Lisa had outdone herself. Through the small bathroom window, I caught a glimpse of the lead vehicle as it swept past. Every car was spotless, polished to a mirror finish that reflected the manor's elegant lighting. The Sterling Enterprises emblem, a stylized eagle that I'd designed myself, was discreetly placed on each rear door, visible but not ostentatious. Professional, powerful, unmistakably expensive. The engines cut off in unison, and for a moment there was absolute silence. Then chaos erupted. "What the hell is that?" I heard someone shout from inside the reception hall. The orchestra, which had been playing a gentle waltz to accompany the main course, stuttered to a halt mid-note. Through the bathroom door, I could hear the scraping of chairs against hardwood floors as 500 wedding guests suddenly abandoned their meals and rushed toward the windows that overlooked the front entrance. "Is that the president?" A woman's voice called out, high-pitched with excitement. 10 limos! Who travels with 10 limos? Oh my God, look at those cars. Those aren't rental vehicles. Someone important must be coming. Really important. I pressed my ear against the door and listened to the pandemonium unfolding outside my marble prison. Footsteps were running in multiple directions, voices overlapping in confusion and speculation. This was better than I'd imagined. The venue manager was clearly in full panic mode. I could hear him barking orders to his staff as they scrambled to figure out what protocol they were supposed to follow when an unannounced motorcade showed up at a private wedding. "Check the guest list again. Did anyone RSVP with the security detail? Should we call the police?" "No, don't call the police. What if it's someone legitimate and we embarrass them?" "But who could it be, the governor? A senator?" Through the bathroom window, I watched as the manor's security guards, 2 men who normally dealt with drunk wedding guests and parking disputes, approached the lead limousine with obvious uncertainty. They'd probably never encountered anything like this in their careers. The drivers remained in their vehicles' engines off, but clearly ready to move at a moment's notice. Professional, disciplined, waiting for orders. I could hear wedding guests pressing against the windows, now their voices getting louder as the excitement built. "Are those government plates? I can't see through the windows. They're too dark." "Maybe it's a celebrity." "Oh my God, what if Taylor Swift is crashing Britney's wedding?" "Don't be ridiculous. Taylor Swift doesn't travel with 10 cars." "Well, someone does." The irony wasn't lost on me. For the first time in my life, I was the center of attention at a Sterling family event, and nobody even knew it was me causing the commotion. All those years of being overlooked, dismissed, treated like an afterthought. And now 500 people were glued to windows trying to figure out what kind of VIP had just arrived at Britney's perfect wedding. I heard rapid footsteps approaching the bathroom door, probably venue staff trying to find alternative routes through the building, or maybe security doing a sweep to make sure no unauthorized persons were lurking in the private areas. Either way, it meant my solitary confinement was about to end. The sound of a key turning in the lock was the sweetest music I'd ever heard. For 37 years, I'd been the Sterling daughter who didn't matter. The one who could be ignored, dismissed, locked away when she became inconvenient. I'd spent decades accepting their treatment, telling myself that love meant sacrifice, that family meant always being the bigger person, that keeping the peace was more important than demanding respect. But as that lock clicked open and I prepared to step back into the world, I felt something I'd never experienced before. Not just anger, not just determination, but pure, undiluted power. For the first time in my life, I wasn't walking into a room as Rose, the disappointment Rose, the afterthought Rose, who could be safely ignored. I was walking in as someone who commanded 10 limousines with a single phone call. The restroom door suddenly clicked open, and I stepped out. The hallway outside the bathroom was empty except for one frantic-looking staff member who was hurrying toward the main reception hall with what appeared to be an emergency radio in his hand. He glanced at me briefly, probably wondering what a wedding guest was doing wandering the back corridors during dinner service, but he was too focused on whatever crisis he'd been dispatched to handle to give me more than a passing thought. I took a moment to collect myself, smoothing down my navy dress and checking my reflection in the antique mirror that hung opposite the bathroom door. The woman looking back at me was someone I barely recognized. Gone was the apologetic slouch I'd carried for 37 years, the way I'd learned to make myself smaller so other people could feel bigger. My shoulders were pulled back, my spine straight as a steel rod. My chin was lifted at an angle that suggested confidence rather than deference. This wasn't Rose the peacekeeper, Rose the family doormat Rose who always smiled and nodded and accepted whatever scraps of affection they threw her way. This was Rose Sterling, CEO and founder of a $400 million empire, and it was time my family met her properly. I walked back toward the reception hall with measured, deliberate steps. Each footfall on the marble floor was quiet, but purposeful, the kind of walk that came naturally when you'd spent years commanding boardrooms full of people twice your age who initially assumed you were someone's assistant rather than the person signing their paychecks. As I approached the main entrance to the reception hall, I could see the chaos my limousines had created. Guests were still pressed against the windows, craning their necks to get a better view of the mysterious motorcade. The orchestra had given up any pretense of continuing their performance and were standing around looking as confused as everyone else. Servers stood frozen with plates of untouched food, unsure whether they should continue service or wait for whatever was happening to resolve itself. That's when I saw him, Charles Morrison, the general manager of Grandview Manor, rushing across the room with the kind of barely controlled panic that comes from realizing you might be about to offend someone very important. Charles had managed high-end events in Seattle for over 20 years, and he had the refined ability to spot real money from a mile away. He knew those weren't rental cars sitting in his driveway. Our eyes met across the crowded room, and I watched recognition dawn on his face like sunrise. He'd handled 3 Sterling Enterprises corporate events over the past 2 years, including our annual board meeting last spring, where we'd spent over $200,000 for a 2-day retreat. He knew exactly who I was and exactly what those limousines represented. Charles abandoned whatever conversation he'd been having and made a beeline straight for me, weaving through confused wedding guests with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd spent decades managing social disasters. "Ms. Sterling," he called out as he approached loud enough that several nearby guests turned to look. "We had no idea you were here tonight. Please accept our deepest apologies for any inconvenience you may have experienced this evening." The effect of his words rippled through the immediate area like a stone dropped in still water. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as people tried to process what they'd just heard. Ms. Sterling. As in the Sterling whose name was probably on half the buildings in downtown Seattle. As in the Sterling whose company had been featured on the cover of Pacific Business Journal for 3 consecutive months last year. I offered Charles a smile that was polite but cool. "Good evening, Charles. I'm just here as a wedding guest tonight. Family event." But the damage was already done. The words Ms. Sterling had been spoken loudly enough that they carried across the immediate area, and I watched as guests began putting together pieces of a puzzle they hadn't even realized existed. The expensive limousines outside, the venue manager's deferential treatment, the Sterling last name that matched the bride's family. I could see Brittany across the room still in her wedding dress but no longer glowing with bridal joy. Her face had gone pale and she was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not dismissal, not condescension, but something that looked almost like fear. She whispered something urgently to David, who followed her gaze and then looked equally shocked. Near the head table, I spotted Mom standing frozen with a champagne flute halfway to her lips. Her mouth was slightly open, and for the first time in my adult life, Margaret Sterling looked completely at a loss for words. She was staring at me as if I were a stranger who had somehow wandered into her daughter's wedding wearing her other daughter's face. As I began walking toward the center of the room, something extraordinary happened. People moved out of my way. Not the grudging half-step aside that you give to someone you're barely tolerating, but the automatic respectful space that people create for someone they recognize as important. Conversations stopped as I passed. Heads turned. I could feel the weight of 500 pairs of eyes following my progress across the room. For 37 years, I'd walked through family gatherings feeling invisible, ignored, tolerated at best. Now, for the first time in my life, I commanded attention simply by existing in the space. These people didn't know my history with Brittany and Mom. They didn't know about years of being treated like the family disappointment. All they knew was that someone powerful enough to travel with a 10-car motorcade had just walked into the room and the venue manager was treating her like visiting royalty. But I wasn't done yet. The master of ceremonies was a young man in his 20s who looked like he'd probably done 100 weddings, but had never encountered anything quite like this. He was standing near the small stage area where the orchestra had set up, clutching his microphone, and looking around helplessly as if someone might appear to tell him what he was supposed to do, when a mysterious motorcade disrupted the evening's carefully planned timeline. I walked directly toward him, my heels clicking against the hardwood floor, with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing you own the ground you're walking on. Literally in this case. "Excuse me," I said, extending my hand toward the microphone. "I believe it's time for the sister of the bride to say a few words." The poor man looked like he wanted to refuse, but between my authoritative tone and the fact that Charles Morrison was hovering nearby, nodding encouragingly, he had no choice but to hand over the microphone. His hands were actually shaking as he passed it to me. I stepped up onto the small platform and the entire reception hall fell silent. 500 people turned their attention to me with the kind of focused intensity usually reserved for major announcements or natural disasters. The orchestra members stood frozen with their instruments, unsure whether they should prepare to play or simply wait to see what happened next. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the excellent sound system that Grandview Manor was known for. "I'm Rose Sterling, sister of the bride." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Most of the guests had probably assumed I was some kind of business associate or perhaps a family friend. The revelation that I was actually Brittany's sister sent whispers racing across the room as people tried to reconcile what they were seeing with whatever story they'd been told about the Sterling family dynamics. I could see Brittany at the head table, her face having progressed from pale to almost green. She was gripping David's hand so tightly that her knuckles had turned white, and she kept glancing toward the exits as if calculating whether she could make a run for it in her wedding dress. "I know many of you are curious about the motorcade outside," I continued, allowing a small smile to play at the corners of my mouth. "I apologize for any disruption to this beautiful celebration. You see, I was unavoidably detained this evening, and my security team became concerned when I didn't check in at the scheduled time." Security team. I could practically hear the gears turning in people's heads as they tried to figure out what kind of person traveled with a security team to a family wedding. Since I have your attention, I thought this might be the perfect opportunity to share some wonderful news with all of you. Many of you may not know that Grandview Manor, this absolutely stunning venue where we're celebrating tonight, recently became part of the Sterling Real Estate Holdings portfolio. The murmur in the crowd grew louder. I paused, letting that information sink in, while I watched Charles Morrison nod confirmingly from the side of the room. "In fact," I continued, "Sterling Real Estate Holdings is now the majority owner of this beautiful, historic property. We acquired a 60% stake just last month as part of our expansion into luxury event venues throughout the Pacific Northwest." The silence that followed was deafening. I could see people doing the math in their heads, realizing that the mysterious sister who had arrived with a 10-car motorcade didn't just have money. She had the kind of money that bought historic mansions as business investments. Near the head table, Mom had sunk into her chair and was staring at me with an expression of complete bewilderment. This was clearly not the Rose Sterling she thought she knew, the struggling middle manager, who needed to be hidden away when important people were around. "So, in a very real sense," I said, my voice warm, but carrying an edge that anyone who'd ever negotiated with me would recognize, This celebration is taking place in what you might call the family home. How wonderfully appropriate. I turned to look directly at Brittany and David, my smile never wavering. I want to take this opportunity to congratulate my sister and her new husband. Brittany has always had such excellent taste, such a keen eye for identifying exactly what she wants. She's always known how to choose what belongs to others. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Anyone paying attention could hear the subtext, could sense that there were layers to this family dynamic that went far beyond typical sibling rivalry. The atmosphere in the room had shifted completely from joyous celebration to something much more complex and uncomfortable. I could see some of the guests exchanging glances, clearly picking up on the tension, but not sure what they were witnessing. A few people near the back had their phones out, probably recording what was turning into the most dramatic wedding speech they'd ever witnessed. My dear sister has always been so talented at taking credit for success. I continued, my voice still perfectly pleasant while the knife twisted. So gifted at presenting herself as self-made while standing on foundations that others have built for her. Brittany was openly staring at me now, her mouth slightly open. I don't think she'd ever heard me speak with this kind of authority, this level of controlled power. For 37 years, she'd known me as the sister who always backed down, who always apologized, who always made herself smaller, so Brittany could shine brighter. The woman standing on this stage was someone entirely different. And as for my wedding gift to the happy couple, I reached into my small evening purse and pulled out my phone, holding it up so the screen was visible to the crowd. The venue's excellent lighting system meant that even people in the back could see what I was about to show them. My wedding gift is the gift of truth, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the sound system. You see, when you own a diversified portfolio of businesses, you sometimes discover interesting connections that others might prefer to keep hidden. I could see David shifting uncomfortably in his chair, his face beginning to take on a grayish pallor that had nothing to do with the lighting. For instance, David, I was reviewing some outstanding accounts at Sterling Bank yesterday. That's one of my subsidiary companies, and I noticed a rather substantial debt in your name. $2.3 million to be exact, from a series of business loans that went into default 8 months ago. The murmur in the crowd grew louder. David's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but no sound came out. Beside him, Brittany was looking back and forth between us with growing confusion and alarm. The loans were for a cryptocurrency investment firm that David claimed would revolutionize digital trading. I continued consulting my phone as if reading from official records. Unfortunately, the SEC shut down the operation for securities fraud before it ever processed a single legitimate transaction. The investors lost everything, and David was left personally liable for the full amount under the terms of his loan agreement. I looked directly at Brittany, whose wedding dress suddenly seemed to be weighing her down like a lead blanket. Did you know about this, sister dear? Did your fiancé mention that he's been technically bankrupt for the better part of a year? That's not true, Brittany said, but her voice lacked conviction. She was staring at David, clearly waiting for him to deny what I'd just said. David, however, was studying his hands with the intensity of someone who'd discovered the secret to the universe in his cuticles. Oh, but it gets more interesting, I said, swiping to a new screen on my phone. You see, David? I was curious about why someone in your financial position would choose this particular moment to get married, so I had my security team do a little research. I held up the phone again this time, displaying a high-resolution photograph that I'd had enlarged and enhanced. The image was crystal clear. David Clark, unmistakably recognizable, locked in a passionate embrace with a blonde woman in what was clearly a hotel room. This photograph was taken last Tuesday at the Four Seasons downtown. The timestamp shows it was captured at 2:47 p.m., and the metadata confirms it was taken with David's own phone, which automatically uploads to his cloud storage account. The crowd was deadly silent now. Even the servers had stopped moving, frozen in place with their trays of untouched food. The woman in the photograph is Jessica Montgomery, who I believe many of you know as the maid of honor in tonight's wedding party. A collective gasp went up from the crowd. I could see Jessica at one of the front tables, her face having gone completely white. She was shaking her head frantically, but the evidence was right there for everyone to see. The hotel records show that David paid for the room with a credit card that was already over its limit. I continued relentlessly. In fact, he's been meeting Jessica at various hotels around the city for the past 6 months, always paying with credit cards that are essentially worthless given his financial situation. Brittany shot to her feet so quickly that her chair toppled over backward. "This is lies!" she screamed, her voice cracking with emotion. "You're making this up. You're jealous and you're trying to ruin my wedding." But even as she said it, she was looking at David, and David was looking everywhere except at her. His silence was more damning than any confession could have been. "David," Brittany said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Tell them it's not true. Tell them she's lying." David opened his mouth, closed it again, then finally managed to speak. "Brittany, I can explain." "Explain what?" she demanded. "Explain why you never told me you were broke. Explain why you're sleeping with my best friend. Explain why you're marrying me when you're in love with someone else." The crowd was starting to shift restlessly. Some guests were pulling out their phones, clearly wanting to capture this unprecedented meltdown for posterity. Others were gathering their belongings and heading for the exits, apparently deciding they'd witnessed enough family drama for one evening. "I needed the money," David said finally, his voice barely audible through the microphone. "Your family has money and Jessica doesn't. I thought I could make it work, thought I could pay everything back before you found out." The confession hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Brittany stood there in her thousands of dollars wedding dress, staring at the man she'd just married, finally understanding that their entire relationship had been built on lies and financial desperation. Brittany's champagne glass shattered on the marble floor. The sound of crystal hitting marble seemed to break whatever spell had been holding the room in suspended animation. Brittany let out a wail that could have shattered the remaining glassware and took off running toward the exit, her elaborate wedding dress trailing behind her like the train of a fallen queen. The delicate beadwork that had probably taken weeks to hand-sew was catching on chair legs and table corners, leaving a trail of scattered pearls and broken threads in her wake. "Brittany, wait!" David called after her, finally finding his voice, now that it was far too late. He stumbled to his feet, knocking over his own chair in his haste to follow her. "Let me explain. It's not what you think." But Brittany was already disappearing through the main entrance, the sound of her sobbing echoing off the marble walls of the foyer. David ran after her, his formal shoes slipping on the polished floor, his voice growing more desperate with each step. "Brittany, please, I love you. I can fix this." The reception hall erupted into chaos. Conversations exploded at every table as guests tried to process what they'd just witnessed. Some people were standing on their chairs to get a better view of the drama unfolding, while others were frantically texting or calling people who hadn't been fortunate enough to witness the spectacle firsthand. "That was absolutely brutal," I heard someone say from a nearby table. "Brutal, but necessary," came the response. That poor girl deserved to know what kind of man she was marrying. But not everyone was on my side. From the other direction, I caught snippets of harsher commentary. How could she do that to her own sister, on her wedding day of all days? It's cruel, that's what it is. Even if it's true, there's a time and a place. She could have told her privately. This was just revenge, pure and simple. The guests were splitting into clear factions, those who believed I'd performed a necessary intervention, and those who thought I'd committed an unforgivable act of sibling cruelty. The arguments were getting louder, with some people actually standing up to face off with others at neighboring tables. In the middle of it all, Mom was trying desperately to salvage something from the wreckage. She'd positioned herself near the head table and was speaking in urgent, hushed tones to anyone who would listen, her hands gesturing frantically as she attempted damage control. "There's obviously been some kind of misunderstanding," I heard her saying to a group of David's relatives. "Family disputes, you know how these things can get blown out of proportion. I'm sure once everyone calms down, we can sort this all out." But it was too late for damage control. The wedding photographer had stopped taking pictures and was packing up his equipment with the efficient movements of someone who'd decided his work here was done. The videographer was already heading for the exit, probably calculating how much of this footage he could legally use without ending up in a lawsuit. The venue staff had begun the delicate process of clearing tables, moving with the practiced discretion of people who'd witnessed their share of high society meltdowns. Servers were quietly removing untouched plates of food, while the catering manager spoke in hushed tones with Charles Morrison about whether they should continue with the planned dessert service. Jessica, the maid of honor, whose affair had been so dramatically exposed, had vanished entirely. Her table was empty, except for her abandoned purse and a lipstick-stained napkin suggesting she'd made her escape during the initial chaos following my revelations. The orchestra had given up any pretense of providing background music and were quietly packing their instruments. The violinist I'd heard earlier was wrapping her bow with the kind of careful attention that suggested she was trying very hard not to think about what she'd just witnessed. I stood on the small stage for another moment, watching the complete dissolution of what had been just an hour ago a perfect fairy tale wedding. 500 people who'd come expecting an evening of celebration were instead filing out into the night, their conversations animated by the most dramatic family implosion most of them had probably ever witnessed firsthand. For 37 years, I'd been the forgotten Sterling daughter, the one who could be locked away when she became inconvenient. Tonight, I'd finally made myself impossible to ignore. The satisfaction I felt was unlike anything I'd ever experienced, a deep, visceral sense of justice finally being served. But underneath the triumph, there was something else. A hollowness, maybe, or the echo of something that had been broken beyond repair. I'd spent my entire adult life trying to earn a place in this family, and tonight, I'd definitively destroyed any chance of that ever happening. I handed the microphone back to the bewildered master of ceremonies and walked calmly toward the exit. The crowd parted before me just as they had earlier, but now the looks I received were a mixture of awe, fear, and respect. I was no longer Rose the disappointment. I was Rose the destroyer. Rose who could bring down a wedding with a single phone call and a few well-chosen words. Outside, my limousines were still waiting in perfect formation. I climbed into the lead car, settling into the leather seats that smelled like money and power, and nodded to my driver. But as my limo pulled away, I knew this wasn't over. The 3 days following Brittany's wedding were the quietest I'd experienced in years. My phone, which usually buzzed constantly with business calls, meeting requests, and the general chaos of running a multi-million-dollar enterprise, had fallen almost completely silent. No angry calls from Mom, no tearful voicemails from Brittany, no attempts at contact from any member of my family whatsoever. I'd expected some kind of fallout, perhaps a furious confrontation, or at least a heated phone call demanding an explanation for my actions. Instead, I got the kind of silence that suggested I'd crossed a line from which there was no return. The Sterling family had apparently decided that Rose the Destroyer was no longer worth their time or energy. I was reviewing quarterly reports in my home office on Wednesday morning when my assistant Lisa called with an unusual request. "Ms. Sterling, I have Harold Kim on the line. He says it's urgent and needs to speak with you immediately about a personal matter." Harold Kim. I hadn't heard that name in almost 5 years, not since Dad's funeral and the reading of his will. Harold had been Dad's attorney for over 20 years, handling everything from business contracts to estate planning. He was a man in his 70s now, old school in the best possible way, with the kind of integrity that had become increasingly rare in the legal profession. "Put him through," I said, curious about what could be so urgent after all this time. "Rose, my dear." Harold's voice carried the weight of his years, but was still sharp and clear. "I hope you're well. I'm calling because I need to see you as soon as possible. There's something I should have given you years ago, and recent events have convinced me that I can't wait any longer." Recent events. Word of the wedding disaster had clearly traveled through Seattle's social circles faster than I'd anticipated. "Of course, Harold. When would be convenient?" "Today, if possible. This afternoon. Can you come to my office? And Rose, please come alone. This is a matter that requires complete privacy." There was something in his tone that made my stomach tighten. Harold Kim was not a man given to drama or unnecessary urgency. If he said something couldn't wait, it meant something significant was happening. I arrived at Harold's downtown office 2 hours later. The building was one of those elegant old structures that spoke of established money and long-standing relationships, the kind of place where Seattle's founding families had been conducting business for generations. Harold's office was on the 15th floor, with windows that looked out over Elliott Bay and walls lined with leather-bound legal texts that had probably been there since the 1960s. Harold himself looked older than I remembered, more frail, but his eyes were as keen as ever. He greeted me with the same gentle warmth he'd always shown, the demeanor of a man who'd spent decades helping families navigate their most difficult moments. "Rose, thank you for coming so quickly. Please sit down." He gestured to one of the comfortable chairs across from his mahogany desk. "I'm going to give you something that your father entrusted to me 5 years ago with very specific instructions about when it should be opened." He moved to an old safe in the corner of his office, one of those heavy models that looked like it could survive a nuclear blast. After working the combination, he withdrew a manila envelope that looked yellowed with age. "Your father gave this to me shortly after his diagnosis, when he first started making arrangements for his estate. He was very specific about the conditions under which you should receive it." Harold's voice grew solemn as he handed me the envelope. He said, and I quote, "Only give this to Rose if something suspicious happens to the will, or if the family dynamics become so toxic that she needs to know the truth." The envelope felt heavier than it should have, as if it contained more than just paper. My name was written across the front in Dad's familiar handwriting, along with a date from 5 years ago, and the words, "For Rose's eyes only." "Harold, what is this about?" "Open it, my dear. Your father will explain better than I ever could." My hands trembled slightly as I broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of Dad's personal letterhead, covered in his neat handwriting. I recognized the pen he'd used, a fountain pen that had belonged to his own father, one he'd only brought out for the most important documents. "My dearest Rose." The letter began, and just seeing those words in his handwriting brought tears to my eyes. "If you're reading this, it means they've hidden the truth from you, just as I feared they might. I'm so sorry, sweetheart, for putting you in a position where you had to discover this on your own." I paused, my heart racing. Hidden what truth? "There are 2 wills, Rose. The one they showed you is not the one I intended to be my final testament. Margaret insisted I change it, threatened to leave me if I didn't put Brittany first in everything. But I couldn't abandon my principles entirely. The real will is hidden where only you would think to look." 2 wills. My father had written 2 different wills. "Find the real one, Rose, and when you do, you'll understand why this was necessary. But more importantly, you need to find Sarah. She deserves to know the truth about who she is and what she's entitled to. I failed her once by letting them push her away. Don't let me fail her again." I read the paragraph twice, then 3 times, but the words didn't make any more sense. Sarah. Who was Sarah? Dad had never mentioned anyone named Sarah to me, not once in my entire life. "Margaret and Brittany will fight you on this," the letter continued. "They'll deny everything, claim I was confused or manipulated. But you're stronger than they are, Rose. You always have been. Find the truth, protect Sarah, and don't let them rewrite history to suit their version of events." The letter was signed with his full name, Robert James Sterling, and dated just 2 weeks before he died. I looked up at Harold, who had been watching me read with the expression of a man who'd been carrying a heavy burden for far too long. "Harold, who is Sarah?" He sighed deeply, suddenly looking every one of his 70-plus years. "That, my dear, is a question I was hoping your father's real will would answer. But first, we need to find it. Someone made sure I never found the truth. Until now." I set the letter down on Harold's desk with hands that were still trembling slightly. The implications of what I'd just read were staggering, but I needed facts before I could process the emotional weight of it all. "Harold, I need you to explain this to me step by step. You said there were 2 wills. What exactly did the original will say?" Harold moved slowly back to his chair, the weight of 5 years of kept secrets evident in every movement. He opened a thick file folder that had been sitting on his desk and withdrew several documents. The will that was probated, the one your family has been operating under, leaves 80% of your father's estate to your mother and Brittany, with 20% going to various charities. It was dated about 6 months before your father passed away. He handed me a copy of the document I'd seen before, the one that had left me with nothing but a few pieces of jewelry and the crushing understanding that even in death, Dad had apparently valued me less than everyone else. But there was an earlier will, Harold continued, dated just 2 weeks later, that told a very different story. In that document, your father left 70% of his estate to be divided equally between you and someone named Sarah Sterling. Your mother and Brittany were to receive 25% combined, and the remaining 5% went to charity. I stared at him, trying to process what he was telling me. Sarah Sterling. He gave her our last name in the will. Yes, and that's not all. The earlier will also included provisions for Sterling Enterprises, the company you built. Your father had apparently been watching your success more closely than you realized. He'd discovered that you were using your maiden name for business purposes and wanted to ensure that your achievements were formally recognized in his estate planning. The room felt like it was spinning. Dad had known about my business success. He'd known I was far from the struggling middle manager I'd pretended to be. Harold, how is this possible? Why wasn't this will the one that was executed? Harold's expression grew grim. That's where things get complicated, Rose. 3 days after your father's funeral, your mother and Brittany came to my office. They said they were concerned about some business documents that might need to be copied for estate purposes. I remembered that day. I'd been too devastated to think about paperwork, too consumed with grief to worry about practical matters. Mom and Brittany had volunteered to handle the legal details, and I'd been grateful for their help. I let them into my private office while I went to get some files from storage. They said they just needed a few minutes to identify which documents might be relevant. I thought nothing of it. They were family, and they were grieving too. Harold's voice grew heavy with regret. When I returned about 20 minutes later, they were just finishing up. Your mother thanked me for my time and they left. It wasn't until later, when I went to review your father's files, that I discovered the original will was missing. Missing from where? From my safe, the same safe where I'd stored it immediately after your father signed it. Harold gestured toward the heavy metal box in the corner. Only 2 people knew the combination to that safe, Rose, your father and myself. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. Dad gave Mom the combination. During his final weeks, when he was heavily medicated and perhaps not thinking as clearly as usual, your father became very concerned about ensuring that all his important documents were accessible to your mother if something happened to him. He gave her the safe combination along with detailed instructions about where to find various papers. Harold's voice dropped to almost a whisper. I believe he trusted her to honor his final wishes. Instead, she used that access to steal the document that would have changed everything. I felt a rage building in my chest that made my wedding revenge look like a minor tantrum. You're telling me that Mom and Brittany deliberately stole Dad's real will and replaced it with an earlier version that benefited them more? I can't prove it in a court of law, Harold said carefully. But the timeline is extremely suspicious. The original will disappeared on the same day they had unsupervised access to my safe, and it's never been found despite extensive searching. Why didn't you report it to the police? Why didn't you contest the probate? Harold sighed deeply. Without the physical document, I had no proof. And your father had indeed signed both wills. The later one simply superseded the earlier one. When the original disappeared, the earlier will became legally valid by default. I suspected foul play, but suspicion isn't evidence. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that it took my breath away. For 5 years, I'd believed that Dad had chosen to leave me virtually nothing. I'd carried that pain, that sense of not being valued, that confirmation of my place as the family disappointment. And all of it had been a lie. Harold, you said the real will mentioned me and this Sarah person equally. That means Dad intended for me to have 35% of everything, not the 20% I thought I was supposed to get. 35% of a considerable fortune, Harold confirmed. Your father was worth significantly more than the public will indicated. There were assets that were deliberately omitted from the probated version. But who is Sarah? And why would Dad leave her anything? I left Harold's office with more questions than answers, but at least I had a direction. If Dad had hidden clues about the real will, where only I would think to look. There was one place that made perfect sense, the old family house where I'd grown up, the one Mom had kept but rarely visited since Dad's death. I drove to the Magnolia neighborhood where I'd spent my childhood, parking in front of the modest two-story house that had once been filled with what I'd thought was a normal, happy family. Mom had moved to a downtown condo after Dad died, claiming the house held too many memories, but she'd refused to sell it. Now I wondered if her reluctance had less to do with sentiment and more to do with ensuring that certain secrets stayed buried. I still had a key. Mom had insisted all the children keep them just in case, and I let myself in through the front door. The house smelled like dust and old memories, furniture covered in sheets like ghosts of better times. I headed straight for the attic, the one place in the house that had always been Dad's domain, where he'd stored his files, his books, and what he'd called his thinking space. The attic was cramped and poorly lit, filled with boxes that hadn't been touched since the estate sale 5 years ago. I began systematically searching through everything, looking for anything that might explain who Sarah was and why Dad had included her in his will. Most of the boxes contained the usual accumulation of family life, old tax returns, Christmas decorations, photo albums from family vacations. It was behind a stack of Dad's old business journals that I found a section of wall paneling that didn't quite line up with the rest. When I pressed against it, a small panel shifted, revealing a hidden compartment that couldn't have been more than 2 feet square. Inside was a metal document box, the kind designed to protect important papers from fire or flood. My hands were shaking as I lifted it out and set it on the dusty attic floor. The box wasn't locked, but the hinges creaked with age as I opened it. The first thing I saw was a birth certificate, Sarah Elizabeth Sterling, born March 15, 1986. My breath caught in my throat. 1986. The same year I was born, just 3 months after my own birthday. The father was listed as Robert James Sterling. My father. I had a sister. Not just Brittany, but another sister, someone who was virtually the same age as me. Someone I'd never heard of, never met, never even knew existed. Beneath the birth certificate was a stack of photographs, and the images they contained rewrote everything I thought I knew about my family. There was Dad looking younger and happier than I remembered him, holding a little girl with dark curls and serious eyes. There was a photo of him pushing 2 children on swings, me on one swing, this other little girl on the other. There was a Christmas morning picture that made my heart stop completely. On the back, in Dad's handwriting, my 3 daughters, Christmas 1992. 3 daughters. In the photo, Dad was sitting on the floor in front of our old Christmas tree with 3 little girls around him. I recognized myself immediately, 6 years old and gap-toothed, holding a new doll. Brittany was there too, just 3 years old and already beautiful, clutching a stuffed unicorn. But between us sat another girl about my age with Dad's eyes and an uncertain smile. I'd never seen this photo before. I had no memory of this Christmas, no recollection of this other child who had apparently been part of our family. At the bottom of the box was Dad's personal journal, a leather-bound book I'd seen him writing in countless times but had never been allowed to read. I flipped through pages of his neat handwriting until I found entries from the early 1990s. Margaret is getting more insistent about Sarah, one entry read. She says having another child around confuses Brittany, makes her feel like she has to compete for attention. But Sarah is my daughter too. How can I choose between my children? A few pages later. The ultimatum came today. Margaret says she'll leave and take Brittany with her if I don't cut all contact with Sarah. She says another child will destroy this family, that Brittany deserves to be an only child until Rose is old enough to be a proper big sister. I don't know what to do. The final entry about Sarah was dated 1993. I made the hardest decision of my life today. Sarah's mother has agreed to relocate to another state in exchange for financial support. Margaret promised this is temporary, just until the family situation stabilizes. But looking at my little girl's face when I told her I couldn't see her anymore, I don't think I'll ever forgive myself for this. I sat back on my heels, the journal trembling in my hands. Margaret hadn't just stolen Dad's will. She'd stolen his daughter. She'd forced him to abandon a 6-year-old child to break off all contact with his own flesh and blood just to preserve her vision of the perfect family with Brittany as the only princess. Sarah was erased. But I'm going to find her. I couldn't search for Sarah on my own, not with the resources I needed, and not without risking exposure. The next morning I called Marcus Webb, a private investigator I'd used occasionally for Sterling Enterprises when we needed background checks on potential business partners, or when corporate espionage became a concern. Marcus was ex-FBI, the kind of methodical professional who could find a needle in a haystack and provide you with a detailed report on how it got there. When I explained what I needed locating someone named Sarah Sterling, born in 1986, he didn't ask unnecessary questions about why a successful CEO was suddenly searching for a woman she'd never mentioned before. "I'll need everything you have," Marcus said during our meeting at his downtown office. "Birth certificate, any photographs last known, addresses, family connections." I handed over copies of everything I'd found in Dad's hidden box, watching Marcus study the documents with the focused attention of someone who'd spent decades piecing together people's secrets. Sarah Elizabeth Sterling, born March 15, 1986 in Seattle. Father listed as Robert James Sterling, mother as Jennifer Lynn Torres. This gives me a solid starting point. Within 48 hours, Marcus had found her. Sarah Torres, she's using her mother's surname now, lives in the Beacon Hill neighborhood, he reported during our follow-up call. She's a registered nurse at Harborview Medical Center, works primarily night shifts in the emergency department. Single mother, 8-year-old daughter named Emma. No current romantic relationships that I could identify. The address he gave me was in one of Seattle's more affordable neighborhoods, the kind of area where working-class families scraped by on tight budgets and long hours. I asked Marcus to conduct discreet surveillance for a few days, just to give me a better picture of Sarah's life before I figured out how to approach her. His report painted a picture that broke my heart. Sarah lived in a small 2-bedroom apartment in a building that had seen better decades. She worked 3 12-hour shifts per week at the hospital, usually Thursday through Saturday nights, which meant she was sleeping during the day and had limited time with her daughter. Emma was in 3rd grade at the local public school, often staying with an elderly neighbor, Mrs. Chen, when Sarah hadn't to work. "Subject appears to be struggling financially," Marcus noted in his clinical way. Drives a 2010 Honda Civic with significant wear shops, primarily at discount grocery stores. Daughter's clothing appears to be mostly second-hand. But the child seems well cared for and happy. The surveillance photos Marcus provided showed a woman who looked remarkably like Dad, the same serious dark eyes, the same determined set to her jaw. Sarah was 37, just like me, but the years had been harder on her. She looked tired in a way that spoke of chronic exhaustion, the kind that comes from working physically demanding jobs while raising a child alone. In one photo, she was walking Emma to school, both of them bundled up against Seattle's October chill. Emma was a beautiful little girl with her mother's dark hair and what looked like Dad's smile. In another, Sarah was coming home from her shift at the hospital, still in scrubs, carrying groceries that looked like they'd been carefully selected for maximum nutrition at minimum cost. The most heartbreaking photo showed Sarah and Emma at a playground, with Sarah pushing her daughter on a swing while wearing the kind of smile that parents perfect when they're determined to give their children joy, even when they're exhausted themselves. She has no idea who her father really was. Does she? I asked Marcus during one of our updates. Nothing in her behavior suggests any knowledge of the Sterling family connection, he confirmed. She's never attempted to contact your family or make any claims on your father's estate. As far as I can determine, she believes whatever story her mother told her about her paternity. I spent sleepless nights trying to figure out how to approach Sarah. How do you walk up to someone and say, "Hello, I'm the sister you never knew you had, and by the way, our father was wealthy and left you a significant inheritance that was stolen by our stepmother"? How do you explain 30 years of separation without destroying someone's understanding of their own life story? But the decision was taken out of my hands when Marcus called with urgent news. "We have a problem," he said without preamble. "Sarah's being watched by someone else. Blonde woman, mid-30s, driving a black BMW X5. She's been conducting her own surveillance for at least 3 days, maybe longer." My blood ran cold. "Can you get a photo of this woman?" "Already did. Sending it to your phone now." The image that appeared on my screen confirmed my worst fears. Brittany, unmistakable even from a distance, sitting in her car outside Emma's school with a telephoto lens camera on the passenger seat. "Marcus, I need you to increase surveillance immediately. Full protection detail for both Sarah and her daughter. And I need to know everything about what this other woman has been doing." Understood. But Rose, if someone else is already tracking your target, it suggests they know something you don't. Or they're trying to get there first. But someone else had already found her. Marcus called me the next morning with news that made my blood run cold. Brittany hadn't just been watching Sarah, she'd made contact. "Your sister approached the target yesterday afternoon." Marcus reported, his voice carrying the professional detachment that couldn't quite mask his concern. "She waited outside the apartment building until Sarah came home from her shift, then intercepted her in the parking lot." "What did she say?" I asked, though I already dreaded the answer. I was too far away to hear the conversation, but it lasted about 15 minutes. Your sister handed Sarah an envelope, looked thick, probably containing cash. Sarah seemed hesitant at first, but she took it. I felt sick. Whatever Brittany was planning, she'd gotten to Sarah first, and that gave her a significant advantage. People who are struggling financially are vulnerable to all kinds of manipulation, especially when someone appears offering help with no strings attached. Marcus had managed to piece together more details through follow-up surveillance. Brittany had introduced herself as a family friend who'd heard about Sarah's situation and wanted to help. She'd spun a story about being part of a charitable foundation that assisted single mothers in the healthcare field, complete with a professional-looking business card and what appeared to be official documentation. "The cash was $25,000, Marcus continued. Sarah counted it twice, seemed shocked by the amount. "But here's where it gets interesting. Your sister made Sarah sign something. Some kind of agreement or contract." The contract, as Marcus later discovered through careful investigation, was brilliant in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. Brittany had convinced Sarah that there were con artists operating in Seattle who specifically targeted single mothers with false claims about inheritances and family connections they'd never known about. These scammers. Brittany had apparently told Sarah, find out personal information about people and then approach them claiming to be long-lost relatives with stories about wealthy family members who've left them money. They're very convincing, very professional, and they prey on people who are struggling financially. The $25,000 was presented as a gift from the charitable foundation No Strings Attached, designed to help Sarah get back on her feet. But there was one small favor Brittany asked in return if anyone approached Sarah claiming to be a sister or family member, especially someone talking about inheritances or family money would. Sarah, please contact the foundation immediately before engaging with these individuals. We've been tracking this particular scam ring, Brittany had explained, and we believe they may target you specifically because of your last name and some public records they've accessed. If you help us gather evidence against them, we can offer an additional $100,000 as a reward for your assistance. All Sarah had to do was sign an agreement stating that she would not meet with or provide information to anyone claiming family connections for the next 6 months, giving the foundation time to build their case against the scammers. Marcus had even managed to get a photo of the business card Brittany had left behind. Northwest Family Protection Services. It read with a phone number that probably went straight to a burner phone Brittany had set up specifically for this purpose. The genius of the scheme was its emotional manipulation. Brittany had taken Sarah's natural skepticism about too good to be true offers and turned it into a weapon against the very person who was trying to help her. She'd made Sarah believe that anyone approaching her with stories about family inheritance was automatically a criminal trying to exploit her poverty. By the time I worked up the courage to approach Sarah myself 3 days after Brittany's initial contact, the damage was already done. I found Sarah's address and drove to her apartment building, rehearsing different ways to introduce myself that might not immediately trigger the warnings Brittany had planted in her mind. Sarah was coming home from grocery shopping when I arrived carrying 2 bags that looked carefully planned for maximum nutrition at minimum cost. She was exactly as beautiful as the surveillance photos had suggested, but seeing her in person made the family resemblance undeniable. She had Dad's eyes, his stubborn chin, and something in her posture that reminded me of myself at her age, a kind of determined pride that refused to let circumstances break her spirit. "Excuse me," I said, approaching carefully so as not to startle her. "Are you Sarah Torres?" She stopped walking and turned to face me immediately on guard. Her eyes traveled from my expensive shoes to my designer handbag, and I watched her mentally catalog me as someone who clearly had money. "Who's asking?" "My name is Rose Sterling. I believe we're sisters." The change in her expression was immediate and devastating. Where there had been cautious curiosity, now there was suspicion bordering on hostility. She took a step back, shifting the grocery bags as if preparing to defend herself. "Let me guess," Sarah said, her voice heavy with disappointment that cut me to the core. "You're here to tell me about some inheritance I never knew about. Some wealthy relative who left me money, and all I have to do is pay some fees or provide some information, right?" I realized in that moment just how thoroughly Brittany had poisoned the well. Sarah wasn't just skeptical, she was convinced that I was exactly the kind of predator she'd been warned about. "Sarah, I know how this must sound, but look, lady, I already know about the scam you're running. Someone from the Family Protection Foundation warned me that people like you would be coming around with exactly this story, so whatever you're selling, I'm not buying." But when I finally met Sarah, she looked at me and asked, "Are you here to lie to me too?" The accusation in Sarah's voice hit me harder than any insult Brittany had ever thrown my way. This woman, my sister, was looking at me like I was a predator, someone who'd come to exploit her desperation. And I realized that's exactly what Brittany had trained her to see. "Sarah, please, just give me 5 minutes. If what I tell you doesn't make sense, if you think I'm lying, I'll leave and never bother you again." She hesitated, probably weighing the risk against her curiosity. Finally, she gestured toward a small bench near the apartment building's entrance. 5 minutes. But I'm not going anywhere private with you, and I'm not signing anything." We sat down, and I tried to figure out where to begin. How do you compress 37 years of family dysfunction into 5 minutes? "Sarah, the woman who warned you about inheritance scams, can you describe her?" "Blonde, maybe mid-30s, very put together. Designer clothes, expensive car. She said her name was Jennifer Morrison from some Family Protection Foundation." "That was my sister Brittany. Her real name is Brittany Sterling, and she just got divorced from a man named David Clark. She's not with any foundation. She's trying to keep you away from me because she's terrified of what you might learn." Sarah's expression shifted slightly from hostility to confusion. "Why would your sister care if I meet you?" "Because we're both Robert Sterling's daughters, and because there's an inheritance involved that she's been keeping from both of us." I could see her processing this, trying to reconcile what I was saying with what Brittany had told her. "Sarah, can I ask you something? Growing up, what did your mother tell you about your father?" Her face tightened. "That he was a man who left when things got complicated, that he chose his other family over us, that we were better off without him." "But you wondered about him anyway, didn't you?" Something in her expression cracked open. "Every day. I used to make up stories about why he left, about whether he ever thought about me. When other kids talked about their fathers, I felt like I was missing some essential piece of myself." I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, scrolling to the photos I'd taken of the pictures from Dad's hidden box. "Sarah, I need you to look at something." I showed her the Christmas photo first, the one with all three of us as children, the one labeled "My Three Daughters" in Dad's handwriting. Sarah stared at the image for a long moment, her breathing becoming shallow. That's me. I remember that dress. I remember that Christmas morning. She looked up at me with wide eyes. How do you have this picture? Because I was there too. I'm the little girl on the left. I swiped to the next photo, Dad pushing two children on swings. And this one. Do you remember this day? Tears were starting to form in Sarah's eyes. I used to dream about swings like these. I could never figure out why, but swings always made me feel safe and sad at the same time. Our father didn't abandon you, Sarah. He was forced to give you up. My stepmother. Our stepmother threatened to leave him and take Brittany unless he cut all contact with you. I told her everything then about Dad's journal entries, about Margaret's ultimatum, about how they'd systematically erased her from our family history to preserve their perfect little unit. I explained about the missing will, about Harold Kim's letter, about how Brittany and Margaret had stolen Sarah's rightful inheritance. You were 6 years old when they made him send you away, I continued, but he never stopped loving you. He never stopped thinking about you. That's why he included you in his will he was trying to make up for 30 years of forced separation. Sarah was crying openly now, clutching the phone with the photos. All these years I thought I wasn't good enough. I thought there was something wrong with me that made my own father not want me. There was nothing wrong with you. You were just a threat to Margaret's perfect family dynamic. She wanted Brittany to be the only princess, and you were in the way. I could see the pieces clicking together in Sarah's mind, the way understanding was rewriting her entire life story. But wait, she said, wiping her eyes. If you're his daughter too, why are you helping me? Won't this inheritance thing hurt you financially? Sarah, I need you to understand something. The family you're imagining, the one that excluded you, excluded me too. I spent 37 years being treated like an outsider in my own home. Margaret and Brittany made it clear that I was the disappointing daughter, the one who didn't quite measure up, the one who could be locked away when she became inconvenient. I told her about the wedding, about being trapped in the bathroom while my family celebrated without me. I told her about years of being overlooked, dismissed, and treated like a burden they had to tolerate. I understand what it feels like to be erased, I said. You were completely removed from the family, but I was kept around just enough to make me feel like the failure. We were both victims of the same people, just in different ways. Sarah was looking at me with something approaching recognition now, as if she was seeing our shared experience reflected in my words. They made you feel unwanted too, she said quietly. Every single day. But here's what I've learned: we don't have to let them define our worth anymore. We don't have to accept their version of who we are or what we deserve. Sarah set down my phone and looked directly at me. The money she gave me, the $25,000 that was to keep me away from you, wasn't it? I'm afraid so. And probably to get you to sign something that would complicate any legal claims you might have. She seemed so concerned about me, so worried that I was going to be taken advantage of. Sarah's voice was bitter now. But she was the one manipulating me all along. We sat in silence for a moment, both of us processing the magnitude of what we'd discovered. Two sisters separated for 30 years by lies and manipulation, finally finding each other despite every attempt to keep us apart. Rose, Sarah said finally, what do we do now? I reached over and took her hand. My sister's hand for the first time since we were children. Her fingers were calloused from years of hard work, but they were steady and strong. We held hands for the first time in 30 years, and we began to plan. Our first step was finding the right legal representation. Harold Kim had given me the name of Mark Ellis, a specialist in estate disputes, who had built his reputation on cases involving missing wills and family fraud. Mark's office was in one of downtown Seattle's most prestigious law firms, the kind of place that charged by the minute and delivered results that justified every penny. When Sarah and I walked into his conference room 2 days later, I could see Mark sizing us up with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent decades evaluating whether clients had legitimate cases or were chasing fantasies. He was in his 50s, graying at the temples with the kind of calm confidence that comes from winning more battles than you've lost. "Tell me everything," he said simply after we'd made our introductions. I laid out the whole story. Dad's hidden letter, the missing original will, Harold Kim's suspicions about theft, and the recent discovery of Sarah's existence. Mark listened without interruption, occasionally taking notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he turned to Sarah. "Ms. Torres, this is obviously a shock to your understanding of your family history. Are you prepared for what this process might entail? Estate disputes can be lengthy, expensive, and emotionally brutal." Sarah's voice was steady when she answered. "Mr. Ellis, I've spent 37 years wondering why my father abandoned me. If there's a chance to learn that he didn't, that he was forced to give me up, then yes, I'm prepared for whatever it takes." Mark nodded approvingly. "The first thing we need to establish is paternity. Ms. Sterling, you mentioned finding a birth certificate, but we'll need DNA confirmation to make this case airtight." "I'm willing to take any test necessary," Sarah said immediately. "We'll also need to test against a sample from your father. Do you have access to any of his personal effects? Hair from a brush, anything with genetic material." I thought about the items I'd kept from Dad's belongings: his favorite coffee mug, a sweater that still smelled like his cologne, his reading glasses. "I have several things at home. Will that work?" "More than enough. I'll arrange for the testing to be done by an independent lab, one that can't be challenged in court." The DNA results came back 5 days later. 99.7% probability that Sarah and I shared the same father. Mark called us both into his office to review the findings, and I watched Sarah's face as he explained the scientific certainty of our relationship. "This removes any question about your standing to challenge the will," Mark told her. "You are legally Robert Sterling's daughter with all the rights that entails." Mark outlined his strategy with the methodical precision of a general planning a campaign. "We're going to file suit against Margaret Sterling for fraudulent concealment and theft of estate documents. We'll argue that the will currently in probate was superseded by a later document that was deliberately destroyed or hidden." He pulled out a thick folder and spread several documents across the conference table. "The challenge is that we need more than just Harold Kim's testimony about the missing will. Courts are reluctant to overturn probated estates based solely on claims about documents that can't be produced." "What kind of additional evidence do we need?" I asked. "Witnesses who saw the original will. Documentation of its existence, maybe correspondence between your father and Harold about its contents, bank records showing unusual activity around the time it disappeared. Anything that establishes a pattern of deceptive behavior by the defendants," Sarah spoke up. "What about the contract Brittany had me sign, the one where she pretended to be from a family protection foundation and got me to agree not to meet with anyone claiming to be family?" Mark's eyebrows raised. "You still have that document?" "Yes, and I never cashed the check she gave me. I was too suspicious about the whole thing." "That's excellent evidence of consciousness of guilt. It shows they knew about your existence and were actively trying to prevent you from learning about your inheritance." Over the next hour, Mark laid out a timeline for the litigation. Filing motions, discovery phases, depositions, and ultimately a trial if Margaret and Brittany refused to settle. He estimated the process could take anywhere from 18 months to 3 years, depending on how aggressively the other side fought. "I want to be clear about costs," Mark said, looking directly at me. "A case like this could easily run into 7 figures in legal fees. Are you prepared for that level of financial commitment?" "Whatever it takes," I said without hesitation. "Money isn't the issue here. And Ms. Torres, while Ms. Sterling has offered to cover the legal costs you'll need to be available for extensive depositions, document review, and potentially weeks of trial testimony, this will consume a significant portion of your life for the foreseeable future." Sarah glanced at me, then back at Mark. "Mr. Ellis, I've been a single mother working night shifts for 8 years. I've learned how to make room for what's important. This is important." Mark smiled for the first time since we'd met him. "Then we have a case." As we prepared to leave, Mark handed each of us his card and a thick packet of preliminary documents to review. "I'll begin filing motions next week, but I need to warn you both, once we start this process, the other side is going to fight back hard. Estate disputes bring out the worst in families, and from what you've told me about Margaret and Brittany Sterling, they're not going to surrender anything without a battle." Sarah and I walked out of the law office together, and for the first time since Dad's death, I felt like I wasn't facing my family's dysfunction alone. I had a sister, a real sister, who understood what it meant to be discarded by people who were supposed to love you unconditionally. "Rose," Sarah said as we reached the parking garage, "I need you to know something. Even if we lose this case, even if we never see a penny of inheritance, finding you has changed my life. For the first time, I feel like I belong somewhere." I felt tears stinging my eyes. That's exactly how I feel, like I finally have real family. But Margaret and Brittany weren't going to let us win without a fight. The retaliation began within a week of our meeting with Mark Ellis. I should have expected it, but somehow I'd underestimated just how far Margaret and Brittany were willing to go to protect their stolen inheritance. I discovered the first attack on a Tuesday morning when I arrived at Sterling Enterprises to find my Mercedes sitting in the executive parking space with all 4 windows smashed and both front tires slashed. Glass glittered across the asphalt like diamonds, and someone had keyed deep scratches into the driver's side door that spelled out a single word: liar. Building security was apologetic, but unhelpful. "I'm so sorry, Ms. Sterling. The cameras in that section of the parking garage malfunctioned sometime after midnight. We've never had equipment failure like that before. It's like someone knew exactly which cameras to disable." Of course they did. This wasn't random vandalism, it was a message. And the timing, just days after we'd filed our initial legal motions, made it clear who was sending it. The next attack targeted Sarah, and it was more sophisticated than simple property damage. She called me in a panic on Thursday afternoon, her voice shaking as she explained what had happened. "Rose, I got an official-looking document in the mail today. It's a court summons saying I have to appear at Seattle Municipal Court tomorrow morning for something called fraudulent inheritance claims. It says if I don't show up, a warrant will be issued for my arrest." I felt ice form in my stomach. "Sarah, what's the exact name on the document?" "It says, the State of Washington versus Sarah Elizabeth Torres, case number CV 2024-8847. It looks completely legitimate, official letterhead, judge's signature, everything." "Give me the case number and don't go anywhere until I call you back." I immediately called Mark Ellis, who had his paralegal run the case number through the court system. As I'd suspected, no such case existed. The document was a sophisticated fake complete with forged judicial signatures and fabricated case numbers. "Someone went to considerable trouble to create this," Mark told me. "This isn't amateur hour. They use the correct legal formatting, accurate court letterhead, even the proper case number format. But it's completely fraudulent." Sarah had already wasted half a day driving to the courthouse and waiting in various offices while clerks searched unsuccessfully for a case that didn't exist. By the time she'd confirmed it was fake, she'd missed a shift at the hospital and had to explain to her supervisor why she'd disappeared without notice. But the most insidious attack came through digital channels. I first noticed something was wrong when my assistant Lisa called me at home on Friday evening, her voice tight with concern. "Ms. Sterling, we have a problem. Someone has hacked your email accounts and is sending messages to our client list. They're also posting on your LinkedIn and Twitter accounts." I logged into my email to find dozens of messages that had been sent from my account to Sterling Enterprises' biggest clients. The messages were carefully crafted to sound like they came from me, but they painted a picture of a woman having a mental breakdown. One email to our largest telecommunications client read, "I need to inform you that I've been dealing with some family issues that have affected my judgment recently. My sister has been filling my head with conspiracy theories about inheritance fraud, and I'm not sure I can trust my own perceptions anymore. Please be patient with me as I work through these psychological challenges." Another message sent to a major retail chain we'd worked with for 3 years was even more damaging. I want to be transparent about some personal issues that might impact our business relationship. I've recently discovered I have a sister I never knew about, and the emotional trauma has triggered some mental health concerns that my family is worried about. They think I might be becoming paranoid and making poor business decisions. The social media posts were worse. Someone had used my LinkedIn account to share articles about how to recognize when grief becomes pathological and family scammers who target grieving relatives. My Twitter account was posting rambling threads about feeling confused about family relationships and wondering if people I trust might be lying to me. The genius of the attack was its subtlety. The messages didn't directly accuse me of being mentally ill. They presented as me being transparently concerned about my own mental state. To anyone who didn't know the real story, I would appear to be a successful businesswoman having a very public breakdown over family drama. By Monday morning, I'd received concerned calls from 4 major clients who wanted to discuss whether Sterling Enterprises was still capable of handling their accounts. My reputation, built over 15 years of flawless professional performance, was being systematically undermined by people who wanted to discredit me before I could expose their crimes. That's when Margaret called me for the first time since the wedding disaster. "Rose, darling, I'm so worried about you." Her voice carried that same fake maternal concern she'd perfected when I was a child. "People are saying such strange things about you online. And this business with some woman claiming to be your sister. Honestly, sweetheart, I think you might need professional help." "Professional help, Mom, really?" "Don't use that tone with me, young lady. I'm trying to help you. This fantasy you've constructed about missing wills and secret sisters, it's not healthy. Your father left things exactly as he intended, and trying to change that now is just going to hurt everyone involved." The audacity of her gaslighting was breathtaking. She was calling me delusional for discovering the truth about crimes she'd committed. "And what about the attacks on my business, the fake court documents sent to Sarah? I suppose those are just coincidences." "Rose, honey, I don't know what you're talking about. But I do know that when people are under stress, they sometimes see conspiracies where none exist. Maybe these things are just unfortunate coincidences, and you're connecting them because you're not thinking clearly." Even as she spoke, I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. She was enjoying this the way she'd managed to make me look unstable while positioning herself as the concerned mother trying to help her troubled daughter. "What do you want, Margaret?" "I want my daughter back. I want you to stop this destructive path you're on before you ruin your career and your reputation completely. Drop this legal nonsense, cut contact with this Sarah person who's obviously manipulating you, and let's get back to being a family." "And if I don't?" The silence on the other end stretched for several seconds. When Margaret spoke again, her voice had lost all pretense of maternal warmth. "Then I suppose we'll have to let people draw their own conclusions about your mental state. And Rose, the evidence is becoming quite compelling." They wanted to silence us, but I was ready to make more noise than they ever imagined. Margaret's threat lit a fire under our legal preparations that turned what had been methodical planning into an all-out mobilization for war. Mark Ellis worked around the clock to finalize our court filings, and within 72 hours of my mother's ominous phone call, we had officially filed suit in King County Superior Court. The lawsuit was comprehensive fraudulent concealment of estate documents, theft of inheritance, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and conspiracy to defraud beneficiaries. Mark had crafted the language carefully to ensure maximum legal impact while keeping the door open for media coverage that might pressure Margaret and Brittany into a settlement. That media attention came sooner than expected. The Seattle Times picked up the story first with a headline that made my coffee go cold: "Sterling Family Fortune Sparks Legal Battle Over Missing Will." By the end of the week, the story had been picked up by regional outlets and legal blogs that specialized in high-stakes inheritance disputes. The coverage forced me to confront an uncomfortable reality: this case was going to be very public. Every detail of our family's dysfunction would be dissected in newspapers and online forums. But the alternative was letting Margaret and Brittany keep what they'd stolen, and that was unacceptable. More concerning than media attention was the escalating surveillance that Marcus Webb reported around both Sarah and me. His team had identified at least 3 different private investigators conducting organized monitoring of our daily routines, plus what appeared to be attempts to gather information about Sarah's daughter Emma from her school and neighbors. "This has moved beyond simple intimidation," Marcus told me during an emergency briefing. "Someone is building detailed profiles of your movements, your vulnerabilities, and potential pressure points. I strongly recommend upgrading to full executive protection services." By the following Monday, I'd hired Blackstone Security, the same firm that protected Fortune 500 CEOs and foreign diplomats visiting Seattle. Sarah initially resisted having bodyguards worried about the expense and the impact on Emma's normal childhood, but I convinced her it was necessary. "Sarah, they've already shown they'll target you with fake legal documents," I argued. "What happens when they escalate to something more direct? I can't risk your safety or Emma's because we're trying to expose their crimes." The security team was professional, but unobtrusive. Sarah's protection detail included a female agent who could blend in at Emma's school functions, and they coordinated with the hospital administration to ensure Sarah's safety during her nursing shifts. For myself, I accepted the reality of having trained professionals monitoring my daily life, a small price for the peace of mind it provided. The breakthrough we'd been hoping for came from an unexpected source. Dorothy Washington had worked as a housekeeper for our family for nearly 20 years, retiring just before Dad's death. She was a quiet, observant woman who'd always treated me with more kindness than my own family members did. Dorothy called me on a Tuesday evening, her voice nervous but determined. "Miss Rose, I've been reading about your lawsuit in the newspaper. There's something I think you should know, something that's been bothering me for 5 years now." We met at a small cafe in Dorothy's neighborhood where she explained what she'd witnessed the day after Dad's funeral. "Your mother asked me to come in and help clean up after all the visitors had left," Dorothy said, stirring her coffee with shaking hands. "I was working in your father's study when Mrs. Sterling came in with a cardboard box and started going through his desk drawers." Dorothy's account was precise and damning. She'd watched Margaret systematically remove documents from Dad's filing cabinet, examining each one before either keeping it or placing it in what appeared to be a discard pile. "Then she took a stack of papers out to the backyard and burned them in that old metal trash can your father used for yard waste," Dorothy continued. "I thought it was strange she was being so secretive about it, looking around to make sure no one was watching. But she didn't know I could see her from the kitchen window." "Dorothy, did you get a sense of what kind of papers she was burning?" "Legal documents from what I could tell, the kind with those blue backing pages that lawyers use. And Miss Rose, she was crying while she did it. Not sad crying, but angry crying, like she was furious about having to destroy something important." Mark Ellis was ecstatic when I relayed Dorothy's account. "This is exactly the kind of circumstantial evidence that can make a case," he explained. "Combined with Harold Kim's testimony about the missing will and the suspicious timing, it establishes a clear pattern of document destruction that coincides with your father's death." Dorothy agreed to provide a sworn affidavit about what she'd witnessed, though she was clearly nervous about going up against the family she'd worked for so long. "I liked your father, Miss Rose. He was always respectful, always treated me like I mattered. If someone stole his last wishes, that's not right." While Mark worked on building our legal foundation, Sarah threw herself into preparation for what would inevitably be a grueling court process. She spent hours with Mark's team reviewing potential questions and practicing her testimony about her childhood, her relationship with her mother, and the circumstances of her father's absence from her life. "The other side is going to try to paint you as an opportunist," Mark warned her during one of these sessions. "They'll claim you're a stranger trying to cash in on a wealthy family's grief. You need to be prepared for very personal attacks on your character and your motivations." Sarah's determination never wavered. "Let them try," she said simply. "I lived 37 years thinking my father abandoned me. If there's a chance to learn he was forced to give me up, I'll face whatever they throw at me." I made sure Sarah had everything she needed: time off from work, childcare for Emma during long legal meetings, emotional support when the stress of preparation became overwhelming. For the first time in my life, I was part of a real family unit where people supported each other instead of competing for scraps of affection. As we moved toward our court date, I felt a mixture of anticipation and dread. We had witnesses who could testify to Margaret's suspicious behavior. We had evidence of her attempts to silence and discredit us. We had DNA proof of Sarah's relationship to Dad and documentation of his intentions to include her in his legacy. But Margaret and Brittany had resources too expensive: lawyers, social connections, and a willingness to destroy anyone who threatened their stolen inheritance. They'd already shown they would attack our reputations, our businesses, and our peace of mind. We had witnesses, evidence, and determination. They had secrets we were about to uncover. The morning of our court date arrived gray and drizzling, typical Seattle weather that seemed to match the somber gravity of what we were about to face. I arrived at King County Superior Court 30 minutes early to find the courthouse steps already crowded with reporters and cameras from local news stations. The Sterling family legal battle had captured public attention in a way that surprised even Mark Ellis. Inside the courthouse, the scene was even more intense. The gallery was packed with spectators. Some appeared to be legal professionals observing a high-profile case. Others looked like curious members of the public, drawn by the media coverage. I recognized several faces from Seattle's social circles, people who probably knew my family and were here to witness our very public airing of grievances. Sarah arrived moments after I did, looking pale but determined in a navy blue suit we'd chosen specifically to project competence and respectability. She'd taken the day off from the hospital, arranging coverage for her shift at considerable personal expense, but she walked into that courtroom with her head held high. We took our seats at the plaintiff's table, and for the first time in our adult lives, Sarah and I sat side by side as sisters. When she reached over and took my hand, the simple gesture felt monumental. Here we were, two women who'd been separated by lies and manipulation for 30 years, finally united in seeking justice for our father's stolen legacy. I noticed several members of the jury panel watching our interaction with expressions that ranged from curiosity to sympathy. The sight of two middle-aged women supporting each other through what was obviously a difficult family crisis seemed to resonate with people who'd probably experienced their own inheritance disputes or family betrayals. Margaret and Brittany made their entrance like they were arriving at a social event rather than a legal proceeding. Margaret wore an expensive black suit that probably cost more than Sarah made in a month, while Brittany had chosen a demure gray dress that was clearly calculated to make her appear vulnerable and sympathetic. But it was their legal representation that truly demonstrated the resources they were prepared to deploy against us. 4 attorneys from Morrison and Associates filed into the courtroom like a small army, each carrying multiple briefcases and exuding the kind of confidence that comes from charging $2,000 an hour. The lead counsel was Patricia Morrison herself, a woman whose reputation for aggressive litigation had made her one of the most feared estate attorneys in the Pacific Northwest. The contrast was stark and intentional. Mark Ellis, despite his expertise and track record, was a solo practitioner working with a small support team. Margaret and Brittany had brought enough legal firepower to handle a corporate merger, sending a clear message about how seriously they were taking this threat to their stolen inheritance. Judge Patricia Coleman entered the courtroom at precisely 9 o'clock, and the bailiff's call for everyone to rise created a moment of absolute silence. Judge Coleman was in her early 60s, with gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that suggested she'd presided over every type of family drama imaginable. "Be seated," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. "We are here today in the matter of Sterling versus Sterling case number CV 2024-9847. This court will hear allegations regarding the validity of a probated will and claims of fraudulent concealment of estate documents." Judge Coleman's opening remarks were delivered with the gravity that such cases deserved. "Let me be clear from the outset," she continued. "Disputes over wills and inheritance are among the most emotionally charged cases that come before this court. Families are torn apart by these proceedings, reputations are destroyed, and relationships are permanently damaged." She looked directly at our table, then at Margaret and Brittany's legal team. However, the integrity of our estate system depends on ensuring that the true final wishes of the deceased are honored, regardless of how uncomfortable that truth might be for surviving family members. If someone has deliberately concealed or destroyed a valid will, this court will not hesitate to impose appropriate sanctions and remedies. The judge's words sent a clear signal that she wasn't going to be swayed by emotional appeals or social status. This was going to be decided on evidence and legal merit, which was exactly what we'd hoped for. Mark Ellis rose to deliver our opening statement outlining the case we'd built over months of investigation. He spoke about Dad's hidden letter, the missing will, Dorothy Washington's testimony about document burning, and the systematic attempts to silence Sarah and discredit me. Your Honor, Mark concluded, the evidence will show that Margaret Sterling and Brittany Clark engaged in a calculated scheme to steal an inheritance that rightfully belonged to Robert Sterling's daughters. They erased one daughter from family history and marginalized the other, all while enriching themselves with assets that were never meant to be theirs. Patricia Morrison's response was swift and brutal. She painted Sarah as an opportunist who'd appeared out of nowhere with fabricated claims about a relationship that couldn't be verified. She characterized me as a bitter daughter whose business success had made her resentful of her family's happiness. The plaintiffs are asking this court to overturn a properly probated will based on conspiracy theories and the supposed testimony of a man who's been dead for 5 years, Morrison argued. Robert Sterling's final wishes were clear and legally documented. His widow and surviving daughter should not be subjected to this harassment simply because his other daughter has convinced herself she deserves more than he chose to give her. The battle lines were drawn and both sides had made their positions clear. But as Patricia Morrison sat down and Judge Coleman called for the first witness, I noticed her making a subtle gesture to someone in the back of the courtroom. And then they called their secret weapon. The bailiff's voice echoed through the courtroom. The court calls John Miller. I felt my blood turn to ice. My ex-husband of 15 years was walking toward the witness stand as Margaret's secret weapon. I hadn't seen John in over 3 years, and his presence here felt like a betrayal I hadn't anticipated. John avoided eye contact with me as he was sworn in, focusing instead on Patricia Morrison, who rose with the predatory smile of a lawyer about to draw blood. Mr. Miller, please state your relationship to the plaintiff. I was married to Rose for 12 years. We divorced in 2019. During your marriage, did you observe Ms. Sterling's relationship with money? John's voice was quiet but clear. Rose was obsessively focused on money. She would stay up late checking bank statements, reviewing investment accounts multiple times daily. She had this constant fear that we didn't have enough, even when we were financially secure. I could feel the jury's attention shifting as Morrison continued her attack. How would you describe Ms. Sterling's relationship with her family? John shifted uncomfortably. Rose always felt her family didn't appreciate her. She would work herself into states where she was convinced they were deliberately trying to hurt her. Sometimes she seemed paranoid about their motivations. The jury's sympathy was visibly cooling. Morrison pressed her advantage. During your divorce proceedings, did you discover irregularities in how Miss Sterling handled financial documents? This was the moment I dreaded. Yes. My attorney discovered that Rose had altered bank statements and investment records, inflating values, to make it look like she'd contributed more to our joint finances than she actually had. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Mark Ellis objected, but Judge Coleman allowed the testimony to stand. Morrison produced a document. Your Honor, I'd like to enter this psychological evaluation from Ms. Sterling's divorce proceedings. Despite Mark's objections about medical privilege, the judge allowed it with limitations. Following your divorce, did Ms. Sterling seek psychological treatment? Yes. She was seeing a therapist for what she called family trauma and trust issues. She told me she was having trouble distinguishing between real slights and imagined ones, and that her therapist was helping her work through paranoid thoughts. I wanted to scream. Yes, I'd seen a therapist after discovering my marriage was deteriorating while John pretended everything was fine, but he was making me sound fundamentally unstable and prone to conspiracy theories. Morrison's final question was devastating. Based on your 12 years with Ms. Sterling, do you believe she has the emotional stability to handle a large inheritance responsibly? Mark objected that John wasn't qualified to give expert opinion, and Judge Coleman sustained it, but the damage was done. Several jury members were now looking at me with skepticism rather than sympathy. During recess, Sarah gripped my hand tightly. "Rose, don't let him get to you. We know who you really are." "But do they?" I whispered, nodding toward the jury. "He just made me sound like a paranoid gold digger." "Then we tell them the truth," Sarah said firmly. "All of it. Show them that being imperfect doesn't make you a liar." Mark's cross-examination established that John had financial motivations for disparaging me, and that his characterizations came from a contentious divorce proceeding. But the core damage was done. My credibility had been systematically undermined by someone who'd once promised to love and support me. When Judge Coleman called for the next witness, I knew it was time to defend myself. Time to stop hiding behind legal strategies and show the jury exactly who Rose Sterling really was, flaws and all. When it was my turn to speak, I told them the truth about being the imperfect daughter. When Mark Ellis called me to the witness stand, I felt every eye in the courtroom following my movement. The jury had just heard my ex-husband paint me as unstable and money-obsessed. Now it was my turn, and I knew honesty was my only weapon. I placed my hand on the Bible and made a decision that went against every legal strategy. I was going to be completely honest about my flaws. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice steady despite trembling hands. "My ex-husband just told you some unflattering things about me, and I'm not going to pretend they're all lies." Several jury members leaned forward, clearly not expecting this approach. I wasn't perfect. I made mistakes in my marriage. I struggled with depression after losing my father, and yes, I saw a therapist because I was having trouble processing grief and family relationships that had never been healthy. I saw understanding beginning to replace skepticism in their expressions. John mentioned I was obsessed with money, and there's some truth to that, but I was obsessed with financial security because I'd spent my childhood watching medical bills nearly bankrupt us. When my father got cancer, I dropped out of Harvard to work and help pay for treatment. That trauma stays with you. Several jury members nodded with recognition. He also mentioned I altered financial documents during our divorce. That's true, and I'm not proud of it. I inflated investment values because I was angry and wanted credit for contributions I felt had been minimized. It was wrong, and I paid consequences in our settlement. The courtroom was silent. Even Margaret and Brittany looked surprised by my candor. But I want to be clear about why I'm here. I'm not here for money. I built my own fortune. Sterling Enterprises is worth over $400 million. I have more money than I could spend in lifetimes. Several jury members looked shocked, clearly having been told I was motivated by financial desperation. I'm here because my father's last wish was for his daughters, all of us, to be taken care of. When he was dying, he made me promise to look after my sister. I thought he meant Brittany and I spent 15 years trying to honor that promise despite being treated like an outsider. My voice began shaking, but I continued. When I discovered another sister, Sarah, who'd been completely erased from our family history, I realized my father's promise was bigger than I'd understood. He wanted all his daughters protected, provided for, and to know they were loved. I looked at Sarah, tears in her eyes. Sarah grew up believing her father abandoned her. She's worked night shifts as a nurse for years, struggling to support her daughter while never knowing she came from a family that could have helped. She was denied not just financial support, but knowledge that she was wanted. Turning back to the jury, I strengthened my voice. My stepmother and Brittany didn't just steal money when they destroyed my father's real will. They stole Sarah's identity, her history, her belonging. They stole 30 years of knowing she had a father who loved her. I looked directly at each jury member. John testified I have paranoid thoughts about family betrayal. After discovering the missing will, the systematic erasure of my sister, the attempts to silence us through intimidation and false documents, I think my instincts about betrayal were more accurate than anyone realized. I delivered my final statement with conviction. If wanting to honor my father's memory and protect my newfound sister makes me unstable, then I accept that judgment. But I won't accept that money stolen through fraud should remain with thieves simply because they're related to me. The profound silence that followed showed the jury processing my words, weighing my admitted flaws against the larger story of manipulation and theft. Mark's follow-up questions were brief, establishing timeline and my relationship with Harold Kim. When Patricia Morrison cross-examined me, my complete honesty had made me difficult to attack. I'd already admitted everything she might use against me. As I stepped down, I felt drained, but relieved. For the first time, I'd presented myself exactly as I was, flawed and complicated, but fundamentally honest about my motivations. But the evidence that changed everything wasn't mine to give. It was Sarah's. When Mark called Sarah to the witness stand, the courtroom held its breath. Sarah walked forward with quiet dignity, her resemblance to our father unmistakable to anyone paying attention. Mark began gently establishing her background as a registered nurse and single mother. Her voice carried the calm competence of someone accustomed to medical emergencies. Ms. Torres, when did you first learn Robert Sterling might be your biological father? 3 months ago when Rose contacted me. Before that, I had no idea who my father was. My mother told me he left when I was young. Sarah withdrew a yellowed letter from her folder. After meeting Rose, I searched my mother's belongings more carefully. I found this hidden in an old jewelry box. She held up the letter in Dad's distinctive handwriting. Would you please read that to the court? Sarah's voice trembled. To my beloved Sarah, I'm sorry I couldn't be there for your 10th birthday. I think about you every day. You are my daughter, and you deserve to know that you are loved even if I can't be part of your life right now. Love, Dad. Several jury members leaned forward, clearly moved by the 1996 letter. Sarah presented her collection birthday cards, sent through intermediaries, Christmas gifts, photographs she'd never seen. These came through Helen Rodriguez at my elementary school. I never understood her kindness, lunch money, school supplies. I recently realized she was my father's go-between. The most powerful evidence was letters spanning 1990 to 2018. The final letter brought tears. My dearest Sarah, I've watched from a distance as you became a nurse, built a life of service. I'm so proud. I hope someday you'll understand why I couldn't be the father you deserved. The choice was taken from me, but my love never wavered. Mark asked about her childhood's impact. It was hard. My mother worked 2 jobs. I started working at 14, babysitting, waitressing, eventually nursing school while working full-time. I became independent by necessity. At 16, I supported myself and helped my mother. I learned not to depend on anyone. She described years wondering why her father abandoned her, feeling incomplete without knowing her family history. Mark's final question, what do you hope to gain from these proceedings? Sarah looked directly at the jury. I never wanted inheritance. Money can't give me back 30 years of not knowing my father. I just wanted to know why he left me. Now I know he never did. He was forced to give me up by people who saw me as a threat. She paused. But if my father intended for me to be provided for, if he wanted me to know I mattered, then his wishes should be honored. Not because I need money, but because erasing someone's final wishes is wrong. The impact was visible throughout the courtroom. Several jury members wiped their eyes, moved by her dignity and sincerity. As Morrison prepared cross-examination, she conferred urgently with Margaret and Brittany. Margaret's face grew red, her composure cracking under undeniable evidence. That's when Margaret shot to her feet, pointing accusingly at Sarah. Then Margaret stood up and screamed, "This is all lies!" Margaret's outburst created chaos in the courtroom. Judge Coleman banged her gavel repeatedly, calling for order as bailiffs moved toward the defense table. Margaret was still pointing at Sarah, her face flushed with rage while Brittany tried to pull her mother back into her seat. Mrs. Sterling, you will sit down immediately or be removed from this courtroom. Judge Coleman commanded, her voice cutting through the commotion like a blade. Margaret slowly sank back into her chair, but her composure was completely shattered. For the first time since this ordeal began, she looked like what she really was, a woman whose carefully constructed lies were crumbling around her. Mark Ellis remained calm, apparently having expected this kind of reaction. He approached the bench with a manila folder in his hand. "Your Honor, if I may present the final piece of evidence that makes Mrs. Sterling's outburst particularly telling." Judge Coleman nodded. "Proceed, Mr. Ellis." Mark opened the folder and withdrew several official-looking documents. "Your Honor, as part of our investigation into this case, we commissioned independent DNA testing on all parties involved. The results are conclusive and frankly more revealing than we anticipated." He handed copies to the court clerk, to Patricia Morrison, and to the jury foreman. The DNA samples were taken from personal effects of the deceased Robert Sterling hair, from his brush saliva, traces from his coffee mug, items that Ms. Rose Sterling provided from her father's belongings. Mark's voice carried clearly through the now silent courtroom. The results show that Rose Sterling has a 99.7% probability of being Robert Sterling's biological daughter. Sarah Torres shows a 99.4% probability of being his biological daughter. I felt vindication wash over me, but Mark wasn't finished. However, the most significant finding concerns Brittany Clark, née Sterling. Mark paused, letting the tension build. Brittany Clark has a 99.9% probability of being Margaret Sterling's biological daughter, but a 0% probability of being Robert Sterling's child. The courtroom erupted. Gasps echoed from the gallery. Jury members turned to look at each other in shock, and Patricia Morrison was frantically whispering with her client team. "The DNA evidence conclusively proves that Brittany Clark is not Robert Sterling's biological daughter," Mark continued over the noise. "She is the product of an extramarital relationship that Margaret Sterling concealed for 34 years. I turned to look at Brittany, who had gone completely white. She was staring at Margaret with an expression of pure devastation, as if her entire world had just collapsed, which in a very real sense it had. This explains why Margaret Sterling was so desperate to eliminate Sarah from the family equation," Mark pressed on. "She wasn't just protecting her daughter's inheritance, she was protecting the secret that Brittany had no legitimate claim to Robert Sterling's estate whatsoever." Margaret was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she rocked back and forth in her chair. The sophisticated woman who had orchestrated years of manipulation and fraud was reduced to a broken shell. Judge Coleman called for a brief recess, but before the bailiff could restore order, Margaret stood up again. This time her voice was barely a whisper, but in the stunned silence of the courtroom, everyone could hear her. "I was afraid he would leave me if he knew," she said, her words coming out in choking sobs. "Robert was so honorable, so devoted to family. If he'd known Brittany wasn't his, I couldn't lose him. So I made sure no one else could threaten my daughter's place in his life." The confession hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Margaret had just admitted in open court to 34 years of deception. She'd let Robert Sterling raise another man's child as his own, while simultaneously forcing him to abandon his actual daughter. "I never meant for Sarah to suffer," Margaret continued, seemingly unable to stop the words from pouring out. "But she was a reminder of everything I wasn't young, the mother of his real child, someone he loved before he learned to love me. I convinced him she was better off without the complications of our marriage, better off making her own way." Patricia Morrison was desperately trying to get her client to stop talking, but Margaret was beyond legal strategy now. "And when he wanted to change his will, when he wanted to include Sarah again after all those years, I couldn't let that happen. Because if he started investigating Sarah's background, he might start questioning Brittany's too." The full scope of Margaret's deception was now clear to everyone in that courtroom. She hadn't just stolen a will, she'd stolen Robert Sterling's relationship with his real daughter while tricking him into supporting a child who wasn't his. So she erased one daughter and invented another's legitimacy. After Margaret's devastating confession, Judge Coleman declared a recess for jury deliberation. The 12 men and women filed out of the courtroom to discuss what had become one of the most dramatic inheritance cases in King County history. Sarah and I found ourselves sitting on a wooden bench in the courthouse hallway, surrounded by the echoes of footsteps and hushed conversations. For the first time in months, I felt an unexpected sense of peace. Despite everything hanging in the balance, despite not knowing what the jury would decide, I wasn't anxious anymore. "How are you feeling?" I asked Sarah, who was staring at her hands. "Strange," she said quietly. "For 37 years I believed my father abandoned me. Now I know he was forced to give me up by someone who was protecting a lie about her own daughter. I should be angry, but mostly I just feel sad for all the years we lost." Through the tall courthouse windows, we could see news vans lined up along the street. Reporters were doing live broadcasts, and clusters of people stood around checking their phones. Mark Ellis had warned us that the story was spreading rapidly on social media, under the hashtag Sterling Truth, with public opinion largely split between those who supported our quest for justice and others who felt family disputes should be handled privately. On the opposite side of the hallway, Margaret and Brittany sat in isolation. No friends had come to support them, no family members offered comfort. Margaret stared straight ahead with the hollow expression of someone whose carefully constructed world had completely collapsed. Brittany kept trying to make phone calls, but each attempt seemed to end in frustration. "She's probably trying to reach David," Sarah observed, noticing Brittany's increasingly desperate attempts to connect with someone. "But he's not answering." We learned later that David had indeed been avoiding Brittany's calls, too busy with his own legal troubles. The divorce proceedings had accelerated after our wedding revelations, and he was fighting to keep what little remained of his assets from being seized by creditors. As the second hour of deliberation passed, I found myself reflecting on everything that had brought us to this moment. The wedding humiliation that had sparked my revenge, the discovery of Dad's hidden letter, finding Sarah uncovering the truth about Margaret's deception and Brittany's parentage. "Sarah," I said, "regardless of what the jury decides, I want you to know something. Finding you has been the most important thing that's happened to me in years. I spent my whole life feeling like I didn't belong in my own family, and now I understand why. I wasn't looking for the wrong kind of acceptance. I was looking in the wrong place entirely." She squeezed my hand. "I feel the same way. Even if we lose everything, at least I know the truth about my father. I know he loved me. I know he didn't choose to leave me. That knowledge is worth more than any inheritance." The third hour dragged by slowly. Courthouse staff came and went. Other cases were called in adjacent courtrooms, and the afternoon sun shifted through the windows. Margaret and Brittany eventually stopped trying to make phone calls and simply sat in silence. Two women who had built their lives on lies that had finally caught up with them. At 4:17 p.m., exactly 3 hours and 12 minutes after deliberations began, the courthouse door opened and the bailiff emerged. "All parties in Sterling versus Sterling, please return to the courtroom." Sarah and I stood up together, straightening our clothes and preparing to hear our fate. As we walked back toward the courtroom doors, I realized that whatever happened next, we'd already won the most important battle. We'd found each other, uncovered the truth, and restored Dad's memory. The bailiff called us back. The gavel was about to fall. The courtroom was packed as we filed back in the air, thick with anticipation. Sarah and I took our seats at the plaintiff's table while Margaret and Brittany sat rigidly at theirs, both looking like they were bracing for impact. Judge Coleman entered with the same composed dignity she'd maintained throughout the trial. The jury foreman, a middle-aged accountant who'd paid careful attention to every detail, stood holding a folded piece of paper that contained our fate. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Coleman asked. "We have, Your Honor." "Please read the verdict." The foreman cleared his throat. "In the matter of Sterling versus Sterling, we find in favor of the plaintiffs on all counts. We find that Margaret Sterling did willfully conceal and destroy estate documents constituting fraud in the handling of Robert Sterling's last will and testament." The words hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. Sarah gripped my hand so tightly I lost feeling in my fingers, but I barely noticed. We'd won. After months of legal battles, intimidation and character assassination, justice had finally been served. Judge Coleman took over her voice, carrying the weight of legal authority. Based on the jury's findings and the evidence presented, this court rules that the original will of Robert Sterling, dated 2 weeks after the document currently in probate, would have superseded all previous versions had it not been unlawfully destroyed. She consulted her notes before continuing. Therefore, the court orders the following redistribution of the Sterling estate. Rose Sterling shall receive 40% of all assets, Sarah Torres shall receive 35%, and the remaining 25% shall be liquidated and used to establish a charitable foundation as indicated in Robert Sterling's final wishes. I felt tears streaming down my face as the judge continued. Brittany Clark, having been determined through DNA evidence to not be the biological child of Robert Sterling, has no claim to inheritance under intestate law. However, she may retain any personal gifts that Robert Sterling gave her during his lifetime, as these were freely given without knowledge of biological relationship. The judge's expression hardened as she addressed Margaret directly. Margaret Sterling, this court finds you guilty of document fraud, theft of estate assets, and conspiracy to defraud rightful heirs. You are hereby ordered to pay all legal costs associated with these proceedings and are permanently enjoined from accessing or managing any Sterling family assets for a period of 5 years. Margaret completely broke down at that moment. The composed woman who had orchestrated years of deception dissolved into racking sobs, her body shaking with the weight of her crimes finally catching up to her. Even Brittany seemed unable to comfort her mother, sitting frozen in shock at the magnitude of what had been revealed. The courtroom erupted in whispers and movement as reporters scribbled notes and spectators reacted to the dramatic conclusion. Sarah was crying too, but her tears seemed to be a mixture of relief, vindication, and grief for all the years that had been stolen from our family. As the judge dismissed the court and people began filing out, I should have felt triumphant. We'd exposed the truth, restored Dad's real wishes, and ensured that Sarah would finally receive what he'd always intended for her. Margaret and Brittany's house of lies had crumbled completely. But as I watched my stepmother and the woman I'd thought was my sister sitting in their devastation, I realized that winning in court was only part of what needed to happen. But I wasn't ready to celebrate yet. There was one last thing I had to do. 3 days after the verdict, I sent a simple message to both Margaret and Brittany. I'd like to meet with you both at Dad's house tomorrow evening at 7. There are things we need to discuss face to face. Sarah was hesitant when I told her about the invitation. Rose, why put yourself through that? We won. The court validated everything we fought for. What more is there to say? We need closure, I insisted. Not just for me, but for all of us. This family has been built on lies and manipulation for so long that nobody knows how to be honest anymore. If we're going to move forward, we need to clear the air completely. Margaret and Brittany both showed up, though neither looked like they wanted to be there. Margaret appeared frail and defeated, wearing a simple black dress that made her look older than her years. Brittany was still beautiful, but there was a hardness around her eyes that hadn't been there before the trial. I led them to the dining room of Dad's house, the same room where we'd shared countless family meals when I was growing up. The mahogany table still bore the small scratch I'd accidentally made with a fork when I was 8, and the chandelier cast the same warm light it had during those long-ago dinners when I'd always felt like I was sitting slightly outside the family circle. Thank you both for coming. I began taking my seat at the head of the table where Dad used to sit. I wanted us to talk without lawyers, without cameras, without any agenda except honesty. Margaret was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. Rose, I know I can never undo what I've done. I never meant to hurt you. When I married your father, I was so afraid of losing him, so terrified that he'd choose Jennifer and Sarah over me and Brittany. Tears started flowing down her cheeks. I convinced myself that what I was doing was protecting my family, but I realize now that I was just protecting my own insecurity. I'm sorry, truly sorry for the pain I caused you and Sarah. The apology felt genuine, but it also felt 30 years too late. Brittany remained silent for a long moment before finally speaking, her voice carrying the same defiant edge it had always had. I'm not going to apologize for being loved by the only father I ever knew. DNA doesn't make family Rose. I was his daughter for 34 years. You can't erase that just because we don't share the same blood. I looked at her steadily. You're right, Brittany. Love matters more than genetics, and Dad did love you. But lying can erase everything else. What's that supposed to mean? It means that the love Dad felt for you was based on truth, even if the circumstances were built on deception. But the love you felt for him, was that real? Or was it just convenience? Because the moment you found out he wasn't your biological father, you could have chosen to honor his memory anyway. Instead, you chose to help steal from his real daughters. Brittany's composure finally cracked. I didn't know when Mom told me about the will, I thought it was protecting what was rightfully ours. And when you found out about Sarah? When you realized she was Dad's actual daughter, who'd been abandoned because of your mother's lies, what did you choose then? The silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of choices that couldn't be undone. I looked at them both and said, "This table only has room for the truth now." The truth hung in the air between us like a sword waiting to fall. I could see in Margaret's eyes that she understood this wasn't just a conversation anymore, it was a final reckoning. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of 37 years of dysfunction lifting from my shoulders. I need both of you to understand something. After everything that's happened, after all the lies and manipulation and theft, I can't continue pretending we're a family. Margaret's face crumpled. Rose, please. No, I said firmly. Family isn't about blood or obligation. It's about love and respect, and there hasn't been any of that in this house for a very long time. Margaret, you're not my mother anymore. You're just a woman who married my father and spent decades lying to him. And Brittany, you're not my sister. You're someone who helped steal from me and tried to erase Sarah from existence. I reached into my purse and pulled out a check I'd prepared before coming here. Margaret, this is $100,000 enough for you to live comfortably for several years. Consider it a final severance payment. I placed the check on the mahogany table between us. This is the last money you'll ever see from the Sterling name. After tonight, we have no relationship, no obligations to each other. Nothing. Margaret stared at the check with tears streaming down her face, but she didn't reach for it. Brittany's voice was hollow when she finally spoke. So that's it. 34 years, just disappear because of some DNA test. Before I could answer, Sarah stood up. Throughout this entire confrontation, she'd remained quietly supportive, but now she stepped forward with a dignity that commanded attention. Brittany, I don't hate you, Sarah said, her voice calm but firm. I understand that you grew up believing you belonged here, that this was your inheritance, your family. But when you learned the truth about me, that I was your father's real daughter, who'd been abandoned because of your mother's lies, you had a choice. You could have tried to make things right, or you could have tried to erase me again. Sarah's eyes never left Brittany's face. You chose to erase me. You tried to buy my silence to convince me that my own sister was a con artist. So no, I don't hate you. But I won't pretend you didn't try to destroy me to protect a lie. Sarah turned to me and extended her hand. Let's go home, sister. I took her hand, feeling the rightness of that word sister in a way I'd never felt with Brittany. Sarah and I walked toward the dining room door together, leaving Margaret clutching her check and Brittany sitting in stunned silence. As we reached the front door of the house where I'd grown up, where I'd spent so many years feeling like an outsider in my own home, I realized something profound had shifted. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel the urge to look back to check their reactions, to worry about whether I was being too harsh. Margaret and Brittany could sit in that dining room with their secrets and their guilt and their stolen years. They could figure out how to live with the consequences of their choices. Sarah and I stepped out into the cool Seattle evening, and I closed the door behind us without a backward glance. The house no longer held any power over me. Within a week of our confrontation at Dad's house, I made a decision that surprised even myself. I put the family mansion on the market and began the process of establishing the Robert Sterling Foundation. The house had been a symbol of everything wrong with our family dynamics, the place where secrets were kept, where Sarah had been erased from photographs, where I'd always felt like an outsider at my own dinner table. It was time to transform those negative memories into something positive. The Foundation's mission was close to my heart, supporting children's services and single mothers who were struggling to build better lives for their families. I thought about Sarah working night shifts at the hospital, raising Emma alone, while never knowing she had family who could have helped. I thought about all the other women out there facing similar challenges without support systems or financial resources. Sarah was hesitant when I first suggested she and Emma move closer to Seattle. "Rose, we don't want to be charity cases," she said during one of our weekly coffee meetings. "I've been independent for so long, I'm not sure I know how to accept help." "It's not charity," I insisted. "It's family. Emma deserves to know her aunt, and honestly, I'd love the chance to be part of her life. I've never been an aunt before." The transition happened gradually. Sarah found a nursing position at Seattle Children's Hospital that offered better hours and significantly better pay. I helped them find a comfortable 2-bedroom apartment in a safe neighborhood with good schools close enough that Emma could walk to class, but far enough that Sarah maintained her independence. Meanwhile, I made my own housing change. The downtown penthouse had served its purpose when I was building my business empire, but it felt cold and impersonal now that I had real family in my life. I found a charming craftsman house in the Wallingford neighborhood, nothing too grand, just a place with character and warmth where people could actually live rather than just exist. Sarah threw herself into helping me decorate the new house, bringing an eye for comfort and practicality that my sterile penthouse had always lacked. We spent weekends browsing antique shops and farmers markets, choosing furniture and art that felt welcoming rather than impressive. For the first time in my adult life, I had a home that felt like more than just a place to sleep between business meetings. Emma adapted to our extended family with the resilience that children possess. She was initially shy around me, probably unsure what to make of this aunt who had suddenly appeared in her life. But when I taught her how to make pancakes on Saturday mornings and helped her with homework on Sunday afternoons, she began to warm up. The first time she called me Aunt Rosie, I nearly cried. We were baking cookies in my new kitchen, and she needed help reaching the flour on a high shelf. "Aunt Rosie, can you get that for me?" she asked so naturally, as if I'd always been part of her world. That simple phrase, Aunt Rosie, represented everything I'd been missing for 37 years. Not the formal, distant relationships I'd had with Margaret and Brittany, but the easy affection that comes from genuine care and shared experiences. Our weekend routines became sacred to me. Sarah would bring Emma over on Saturday mornings, and we'd cook breakfast together while planning some small adventure trips to the zoo, walks around Green Lake, or simply afternoons in my backyard garden. These were the family moments I'd dreamed about but never experienced growing up. But there was still one goodbye I needed to make. 6 months after settling into my new routine with Sarah and Emma, I finally felt ready to do something I'd been avoiding since the trial ended. I drove to Lakeview Cemetery on a gray Seattle morning, carrying with me a letter I'd spent weeks writing and rewriting. Dad's grave was exactly as I remembered it, simple granite headstone with his name dates and the inscription, "Beloved Husband and Father." For years after his death, I'd visited this place feeling angry and abandoned, convinced he'd chosen to leave me with nothing while favoring Brittany and Margaret. Today I came with a completely different understanding of who he'd been and what he'd tried to do for his daughters. I sat on the bench near his headstone and pulled out the letter written on the same cream-colored stationery he'd always used for important correspondence. "Dear Dad." I began reading aloud, my voice carrying across the quiet cemetery. "I'm writing to tell you that we found the truth. Harold Kim gave me your letter, and Sarah and I discovered everything Margaret and Brittany tried to hide from us. I told him about finding the hidden box in the attic, about meeting Sarah and learning how she'd grown up, believing he'd abandoned her. I described the trial, Margaret's confession, and the DNA evidence that revealed Brittany wasn't his biological daughter. You were right to hide that evidence, Dad. You knew Margaret might try to destroy your real will, and you trusted that someday the truth would come out. It took longer than either of us hoped, but justice was finally served." I paused, looking at the dates on his headstone, 1952 to 2019. He'd been only 67 when he died, still young enough to have seen Emma grow up, to have walked Sarah down the aisle if she ever remarried, to have enjoyed being a grandfather to the little girl who now called me Aunt Rosie. I want you to know that I'm keeping the promise I made to you in the hospital. I'm taking care of Sarah just like you asked. But it's not a burden anymore, it's a joy. She's the sister I always needed, and Emma is the niece I never knew I wanted. I told him about the Robert Sterling Foundation, how we were using the family money to help single mothers and children who needed support. I described Sarah's new job at Children's Hospital, Emma's progress in school, and the weekends we spent together creating the kind of family memories he'd always wanted for us. The Sterling name means something positive now, Dad, not because of wealth or social status, but because we're using our resources to help people who need it most. I think you'd be proud of what we're building together. As I folded the letter and placed it against his headstone, I realized this was the first time I'd visited his grave without feeling angry or sad. Instead, I felt gratitude for a father who'd loved both his daughters enough to fight for our future, even when he was forced to make impossible choices. The morning sun broke through the Seattle clouds, casting warm light across the cemetery. I stood up, brushing grass from my jeans, and looked one more time at Dad's headstone. "Thank you for never giving up on us," I whispered. And finally, I felt his presence smiling down on both his daughters. While I was building new memories with Sarah and Emma, Margaret was experiencing the consequences of 30 years of deception in ways she'd never imagined possible. I learned about her situation not through direct contact. I'd blocked her number and had no intention of speaking with her, but through the inevitable gossip network that exists in Seattle's social circles. Margaret had been forced to sell the downtown condo she'd lived in since Dad's death, unable to afford the mortgage payments without access to the Sterling estate assets. She'd moved into a modest one-bedroom apartment in Bellevue, the kind of place she would have looked down on just a year earlier. The woman who had once hosted elaborate dinner parties and charity luncheons now lived in complete social isolation. Her old friends had distanced themselves with the swift efficiency that wealthy social circles employ when scandal threatens to taint their own reputations. The same women who had once competed for invitations to Margaret's events now crossed the street to avoid running into her at the grocery store. Phone calls went unreturned. Charity board positions were quietly revoked, and dinner party guest lists were suddenly full whenever she tried to maintain her social connections. I knew from Harold Kim, who occasionally updated me on legal matters, that Margaret had attempted to contact both Sarah and me multiple times. My phone number had been changed and blocked, but she'd tried reaching Sarah through the hospital, leaving increasingly desperate messages that went unanswered. Sarah had made it clear she had no interest in maintaining any relationship with the woman who had stolen her father and her inheritance. Brittany's visits to Margaret were infrequent and strained, according to what I'd heard through mutual acquaintances. Their relationship had deteriorated rapidly once the DNA results revealed the truth about Brittany's parentage. Brittany blamed Margaret for destroying her life and making her live a lie for 34 years. Bam. The conversations between them were reportedly bitter affairs, with Brittany demanding to know who her real father was, and Margaret refusing to provide that information. The apartment where Margaret now lived was a stark contrast to the spaces she'd once inhabited. Instead of the elegant furnishings and carefully curated art that had defined her identity for decades, she was surrounded by a few salvaged pieces from her former life and photographs that now served as painful reminders of relationships that no longer existed. I imagined her sitting alone in that small living room, looking at pictures of family gatherings where everyone was smiling and pretending to be happy. Photos of Dad holding Brittany as a baby, not knowing she wasn't his child. Pictures of holiday celebrations where Sarah should have been present but had been deliberately excluded. Images of a life built on lies that had finally caught up with her. The woman who had spent decades manipulating family dynamics to serve her own interests now found herself with no family left to manipulate. No husband to deceive, no daughters to pit against each other, no social circle to impress with her carefully constructed narratives. For the first time in her life, Margaret had no one left to manipulate. While Margaret was adjusting to her new reality of social isolation, Brittany was experiencing an even more dramatic fall from grace. The woman who had once been Seattle's golden child, the princess of the Sterling family, was discovering that reputation and connections built on lies had a tendency to crumble spectacularly when the truth emerged. The first domino to fall was her marriage to David. What had begun as a fairy tale wedding had devolved into bitter divorce proceedings within 6 months of our courtroom victory. David's legal team had done their homework, uncovering evidence that Brittany had deliberately concealed information about her family's financial situation and legal troubles during their engagement. The prenuptial agreement she'd signed became worthless when David's attorneys proved she'd committed fraud by misrepresenting her inheritance prospects and family connections. The divorce settlement was devastating for Brittany. David, despite his own financial problems, managed to walk away with most of their joint assets by arguing that he'd been deceived into marriage under false pretenses. The beautiful home they'd purchased together in Queen Anne, the luxury cars, even some of the wedding gifts, everything was divided in David's favor or sold to pay legal fees. Brittany found herself financially ruined in a matter of months, but her personal losses were nothing compared to what happened to her business. Bloom Beauty Salon, which had been her pride and joy for over a decade, became a casualty of the scandals surrounding our family's legal battle. Seattle's wealthy clientele, who had once competed for appointments with the city's most exclusive beautician, began canceling their standing appointments and finding new salons. The boycott wasn't organized or announced. It was the subtle but deadly kind of social ostracism that happens when scandal makes someone persona non grata in elite circles. Women who had been loyal customers for years simply stopped calling. Wedding bookings evaporated. The influencers and local celebrities who had helped build Brittany's reputation distanced themselves to protect their own brands. Within 8 months of the trial's conclusion, Bloom Beauty Salon was forced to close its doors permanently. Brittany had to sell the business equipment and salon space for a fraction of what they were worth, barely covering her outstanding debts to suppliers and employees. The woman who had once been featured in Seattle magazine as a rising beauty star was now facing bankruptcy. With no income, no savings, and mounting legal bills, Brittany had no choice but to sell her remaining personal assets and move in with Margaret. The sight of the two of them, both fallen from their previous heights of privilege, sharing that small Bellevue apartment, must have been a daily reminder of how completely their house of cards had collapsed. Brittany's attempts to rebuild her career were consistently thwarted by her reputation. The beauty industry in Seattle was small and interconnected, and word traveled fast about her role in the Sterling family fraud scandal. Potential employers were reluctant to hire someone whose name was associated with deception and legal troubles. Job interviews that had once been formalities became humiliating exercises in explaining her past. The few positions she managed to secure never lasted long. Whether it was a receptionist job at a spa in Tacoma or a stylist position at a chain salon in Everett, her past always seemed to catch up with her. Customers would recognize her name or face, and complaints would follow. Employers worried about their own reputations would find reasons to let her go. After a year of failed attempts to restart her life in the Seattle area, Brittany made the decision that many people make when their reputation becomes too much of a burden. She left town entirely. I heard through Harold Kim that she'd moved to Portland, then later to Phoenix, apparently trying to reinvent herself with a new identity and backstory. But old habits die hard, and Brittany's pattern of deception followed her wherever she went. The last time I saw her name in print was in a brief news article from Arizona 2 years after our trial. She'd been arrested for running a beauty school scam, taking tuition money from aspiring cosmetologists for a program that didn't actually exist. The booking photo showed a woman who looked older than her years, with bleached hair and the hard expression of someone who'd been surviving on the margins for too long. According to the article, she'd been using multiple aliases and had warrants out for similar schemes in 2 other states. The investigation revealed a pattern of moving to new cities, establishing beauty-related businesses with impressive but false credentials, collecting money from customers and students, then disappearing when people started asking questions. Reading that article, I felt a mixture of sadness and inevitability. The woman who had once had everything handed to her beauty privilege, a successful business, a wealthy fiancé had been unable to build anything legitimate once those advantages were stripped away. Instead of learning from her mistakes and starting over honestly, she'd doubled down on the deception that had defined her entire life. While Brittany was spiraling through a series of increasingly desperate schemes in other states, Sarah and I were building something beautiful and authentic in Seattle. The contrast between their destructive path and our constructive one couldn't have been more stark. 1 year after the trial concluded, Sarah and I decided to celebrate something we'd never had the chance to experience: a shared birthday celebration. Our birthdays were only 3 months apart, and we realized we'd never actually celebrated together despite being the same age. We planned a small party at my house with Emma as our special guest, and the true center of attention. I'd spent weeks planning the perfect celebration, wanting to create the kind of memory that would anchor our new family traditions. We decorated the dining room with balloons and streamers in Emma's favorite colors, and I'd commissioned a custom cake that had "Happy Birthday Aunt Rose and Mommy" written in colorful frosting. When it came time to blow out the candles, Emma insisted on making a wish for both of us. She closed her eyes tightly, took a deep breath, and said, "I wish I could have 2 mommies forever and ever." Then she blew out all the candles in one breath while Sarah and I sat there laughing and crying at the same time. Her innocent wish captured something profound about what we'd built together. Emma had gained not just an aunt, but a second maternal figure who was invested in her happiness and future. And I had discovered the joy of being part of a child's life in a way I'd never experienced before. That evening I made it official. I asked Sarah if she would allow me to become Emma's godmother, not just in name, but with all the responsibilities and privileges that role entailed. Sarah cried when I presented her with legal documents I'd had drawn up, establishing a college fund for Emma, and naming me as her guardian should anything ever happen to Sarah. "Rose, I can't accept this," Sarah said, looking at the scholarship account statement that showed I'd already deposited $50,000. "It's too much." "It's not too much," I replied. "It's what family does. For the first time in my life, I get to help raise a child and watch her grow up. Emma is going to have every opportunity I can provide, and you're never going to have to worry about affording her education or her dreams." What moved Sarah to tears wasn't just the financial security, but the realization that she was no longer carrying the burden of single parenthood alone. For 8 years, every decision about Emma's future, every worry about money for school activities or medical bills, every late-night concern about whether she was doing enough, all of that had rested solely on Sarah's shoulders. Now she had a partner in raising her daughter, someone who was equally invested in Emma's well-being and success. As our personal relationship deepened, Sarah and I discovered we worked well together professionally as well. We decided to channel our experience with inheritance disputes into something positive by establishing Sterling Sisters LLC, a consulting firm that specialized in helping families navigate complex estate issues and family conflicts. Our first clients were people who'd heard about our case and reached out for help with their own inheritance disputes. We found that our combination of legal knowledge, business acumen, and personal experience with family manipulation made us uniquely qualified to guide others through similar challenges. Sarah's nursing background gave her excellent skills in crisis counseling, while my business experience helped families understand the financial and legal implications of their situations. The work was emotionally demanding, but deeply rewarding. We helped families uncover hidden assets, identify signs of elder abuse, and navigate the complex dynamics that arise when money and family relationships intersect. Every case reminded us of how fortunate we'd been to find each other and restore our father's true legacy. Our Sunday tradition became the cornerstone of our family life. Every week, Sarah and Emma would come over in the afternoon and we'd cook dinner together while I told Emma stories about her grandfather. She was fascinated by tales of Dad's kindness, his love of reading, and his dedication to helping others. I showed her photographs I'd saved from his business trips and charity work, helping her build a picture of the grandfather she'd never had the chance to meet. "Grandpa sounds like he was really nice," Emma said one Sunday while we were making homemade pasta. I wish I could have met him. He would have absolutely adored you, I told her, and I meant it completely. Dad would have been so proud of the strong, intelligent, compassionate little girl Sarah had raised. These Sunday dinners filled a hole in my heart I hadn't even realized existed. For decades, I'd focused on building financial success and professional achievements, but I'd never experienced the simple joy of being part of a real family unit. Watching Emma help Sarah stir sauce while chattering about her school day, or seeing Sarah laugh at one of my stories about Dad, gave me a sense of completeness I'd been searching for my entire life. We weren't just survivors anymore. We were family. 2 years after Sarah, Emma, and I had settled into our rhythm as a real family, I received an invitation that would have seemed impossible during the darkest days of our legal battle. The Women's Leadership Summit, one of the most prestigious professional conferences on the West Coast, asked me to deliver the keynote address on a topic I knew intimately: breaking free from family toxicity and building authentic relationships. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same woman who had once been locked in a bathroom by her own family was now being asked to speak to 2,000 successful women about overcoming toxic family dynamics. When I accepted the invitation, I knew this speech would be different from the corporate presentations I'd given countless times before. This would be personal, vulnerable, and honest in ways that terrified and excited me. The morning of the summit, I stood in the wings of the Seattle Convention Center's main auditorium, watching as attendees filed into their seats. The space was massive, tier upon tier of seats filled with women from every industry imaginable. CEOs, entrepreneurs, nonprofit leaders, academics, and professionals who had fought their own battles to reach positions of influence and success. As I waited for my introduction, my mind wandered back to that awful night at Brittany's wedding when I'd been trapped in that marble bathroom reading cruel messages from my family's group chat. I remembered the humiliation, the rage, and the moment when I'd decided I wouldn't be powerless anymore. The contrast between that locked room and this stage where thousands of people had gathered to hear what I had to say was almost overwhelming. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Rose Sterling," the conference organizer announced, and the auditorium erupted in applause. I walked onto the stage with the same confidence I'd carried into courtrooms and boardrooms, but this felt different. These weren't potential clients or legal adversaries. These were women who understood what it meant to overcome obstacles to build something meaningful, despite setbacks and betrayals. As I approached the podium, something extraordinary happened. The applause grew louder, and then people began standing. Row by row, section by section, the entire auditorium rose to their feet in a welcoming ovation that lasted nearly a minute. I had to pause and collect myself, overwhelmed by the warmth and support from strangers who somehow understood that my presence on this stage represented a victory over forces that tried to diminish strong women. I began my speech by telling them about the bathroom door clicking shut, about discovering I had a sister who'd been erased from family history, and about learning that the people closest to us can sometimes be the ones who hurt us most deeply. I spoke about the difference between the family you're born into and the family you choose, about finding strength in truth, even when that truth is painful. For 37 years, I tried to earn love from people who saw me as a threat to their carefully constructed lies. I told the audience. I thought if I just achieved more, sacrificed more, gave more, they would finally see my value. But sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to stop trying to fix people who don't want to be fixed. And I talked about Sarah, about the joy of discovering a sister who shared my values and understanding of what real family means. I spoke about Emma, about how being her aunt had taught me that love doesn't require blood relations. It requires presence, consistency, and genuine care for another person's well-being. The audience was completely engaged, and I could see women throughout the auditorium nodding in recognition, some wiping away tears as they connected my story to their own experiences with difficult family relationships. The most powerful lesson I learned, I concluded, is that you cannot control other people's choices, but you can control your response to those choices. You can choose to stop accepting treatment that diminishes your worth. You can choose to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation. And you can choose to define family as the people who celebrate your success rather than those who try to diminish it. When I finished speaking, the response was immediate and overwhelming. The entire auditorium erupted in applause that grew into a standing ovation lasting nearly 5 minutes. Women were on their feet clapping, cheering, and some were openly crying. The energy in that room was electric. Thousands of successful women celebrating not just my story, but their own journeys of overcoming toxic relationships and building authentic lives. From the stage, I could see Sarah and Emma in the front row, both on their feet, and clapping with genuine pride. Emma was beaming up at me with the kind of pure joy that only children possess, while Sarah had tears streaming down her face as she applauded. Seeing them there, supporting me in this moment of triumph, filled me with a happiness I'd never experienced during any business success or financial milestone. As the applause finally began to die down and I prepared to leave the stage, I took one last look at that sea of faces, 2,000 women who had chosen to spend their Saturday morning hearing about resilience, authenticity, and the courage to demand better treatment from the people in our lives. In that moment, I understood that my journey from the locked bathroom to this stage wasn't just personal. It was part of a larger story about women refusing to accept diminished versions of themselves, about choosing dignity over convenience, and about building lives based on truth rather than the comfortable lies that others want us to accept. They locked me away once thinking I was powerless. Now everywhere I go, they rise to meet me. And I am finally truly free. And that's Rose's incredible journey from being the forgotten daughter to reclaiming her power and finding her true family. From that humiliating moment locked in a bathroom to standing on stage receiving a 5-minute standing ovation from 2,000 women, Rose proved that sometimes the greatest revenge is simply living well and refusing to let toxic people define your worth. What struck me most about this story is how Rose discovered that real family isn't about blood relations or obligations, but about the people who genuinely support your growth and celebrate your success. Sarah and Emma became the family Rose had been searching for her entire life, while Margaret and Brittany's house of lies crumbled under the weight of their own deception. The most powerful lesson here is that you don't have to accept mistreatment from anyone, even family members. Rose spent 37 years trying to earn love from people who saw her as a threat to their carefully constructed world. But once she stopped seeking their approval and started demanding the respect she deserved, everything changed. Margaret and Brittany thought they could control Rose by making her feel small and powerless. Instead, they created someone who refused to be diminished ever again. The woman who once apologized for existing became someone who commanded rooms full of successful people eager to hear her story. I'd love to hear your thoughts on Rose's transformation. Have you ever had to cut ties with toxic family members to protect your own well-being? What would you have done differently in Rose's situation? Share your experiences in the comments below, because these conversations help all of us recognize when we deserve better treatment. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible true stories about people who refuse to let others write their endings. Ring the notification bell so you never miss these powerful tales of resilience and justice. And remember, just because someone gave birth to you or shares your DNA doesn't give them the right to diminish your worth. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to walk away from people who consistently choose to hurt you. Rose's story proves that it's never too late to demand better, to find your real family, and to build a life based on truth rather than the comfortable lies others want you to accept. Thanks for listening to Rose's journey from locked away to finally free. I'll see you in the next story.